Hey there, sleepy historians. Before we begin, take a moment to gently tap the like button. Maybe subscribe if you enjoy dozing off to forgotten tales. And let us know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. Now, settle in. Let's begin our slow drift through the less glamorous, yet still deeply human corners of ancient Greek mythology. It begins, as these things often do, not with a dramatic pronouncement or divine vision, but with a committee. You see, when the people of Ephesus first considered building a temple to honor Artemis, they were not seeking grandeur. They were looking mostly to not be left out. The Ionian cities were always in mild competition. One city had an amphitheater carved into a hillside. Another, a clever harbor improvement project that prevented silt from ruining trade. And Ephesus, watching this regional arms race of civic pride, thought perhaps it should do something equally impressive. A temple. A large one. For Artemis. The goddess Artemis, twin sister of Apollo and protector of wild things, was revered in Ephesus in a particularly regional flavor. Unlike the sleek, bow-wielding maiden of the Homeric tradition, the Ephesian Artemis resembled a fertility goddess, adorned with rounded, possibly symbolic shapes across her chest, interpreted variously as eggs, gourds, or, less politely, breasts. Whatever the case, she was theirs, and they would give her a temple. It was the mid-6th century BCE, and the initial planning began slowly. First, they had to select a site. This was done by a combination of augury, local geography, and a vague sense of convenience. The spot chosen was low-lying near the Cayster River, a place where the soil was soft, ideal for digging. This was also, unfortunately, a place prone to flooding. But that was a problem for later. Then came the funding. As you might expect, the people of Ephesus had limited public funds. Temples were not cheap, especially ones meant to rival those of Athens or Delphi. So the city fathers turned to wealthy patrons. One of them was a man named Croesus, the famously rich king of Lydia. He had been conquered by Cyrus the Great, but not before making several large and symbolic donations to temples across the Greek world. The Temple of Artemis was among the beneficiaries. The design was entrusted to a Cretan architect named Chersiphron and his son, Metagenes. The early plans included over 100 marble columns, each about 60 feet tall. The whole structure would stand on a raised platform to help with flooding. But even so, progress was slow. Marble had to be quarried and moved overland using oxen and wooden rollers. The soft earth made transporting the columns treacherous. The stones would sink or tip. Chersiphron, who was not only an architect but also a practical man, devised a clever method. He designed a system where the columns could be rotated and rolled like massive drums. This, he hoped, would speed up the process. It didn't. A flood soon swept through the construction site, turning months of work into a soggy mess. Foundation trenches filled with water. Earthworks collapsed. Some of the marble cracked or vanished entirely under the muddy ground. Artemis, it seemed, was either testing their devotion or displaying the fickle temper of a local river spirit. But they didn't give up. Years passed, decades in fact. Work would stop during wars, famines, and citywide budget crises. Skilled laborers would leave for better-paying jobs in Miletus or Corinth. Chersiphron died. Metagenes continued. He died too. Other architects came and went. New foundations were laid. Columns rose, then collapsed, then rose again. By the time one generation of Ephesians had grown old and died, their children were just beginning to see the skeleton of a great temple take shape. The structure was beginning to rise out of the swampy plain like a ghost of something not yet real. Marble gleamed under the Anatolian sun, but there was still no roof, no statues, no altars, just an eternal work in progress. From a modern perspective, it's hard to imagine a construction timeline that long. But in antiquity, time moved differently. Projects spanned lifetimes. Entire civic identities were tied to things that wouldn't be completed until your grandchildren were old. And still, they built. Imagine being a young Ephesian laborer hauling stone up wooden ramps, hearing your grandfather say, "This is the same block we moved when I was your age." Imagine being a priest of Artemis, conducting rites on a temporary altar for 40 years, always saying, "Soon the real temple will be ready."
They waited. They kept building. The temple was becoming not just a monument to Artemis, but a kind of living testimony to the stubborn patience of its people. But in that slow pace was also a question, a quiet murmur beneath the layers of marble and time. Would it ever truly be finished? And if it was, what would it even mean to the people who no longer remembered how it all began?
By the time the Temple of Artemis began to resemble an actual building, the political map of the region had shifted entirely. Empires had risen and fallen. The Persians had taken control of much of Anatolia. And yet, in Ephesus, there was still scaffolding on the temple site. This wasn't due to negligence, laziness, or incompetence. Quite the opposite. It was the result of a kind of deliberate devotion, one that modern construction managers might find baffling. Every detail was considered, every carving deliberated, every problem approached with caution and committee discussion. The Ephesians were building something not just for their own time, but for the gods, and the gods, it seemed, had no deadlines. The architectural design evolved as the generations changed. What began as a more archaic structure slowly absorbed Ionian refinements. Column proportions were adjusted, decorative motifs were added, altered, removed, and restored again. The columns themselves were now being carved with relief sculptures at their bases, figures of gods and humans, myths and local legends, each one painstakingly chiseled by hand. No two columns were quite the same. Some of the carving styles shifted over the decades as apprentices became masters and artistic tastes evolved. One could walk through the incomplete colonnade and almost feel the passage of time by watching the stonework grow more intricate, or in some cases, more conservative, depending on which period of political influence had most recently touched Ephesus. Then came the matter of roof construction. Unlike earlier temples, the Temple of Artemis at Ephesus was to have a wooden roof spanning a massive interior hall. To do this, enormous timber beams were needed. These had to be sourced from far away in the mountain forests inland. The logistics of transporting such beams overland required not only manpower, but diplomacy. You needed the cooperation of villages along the way, the safety of trade routes, and enough drachmas to pay for everyone's cooperation. Not to mention mules. A lot of mules. Meanwhile, the priests of Artemis continued to hold rituals in the half-finished space. Worship didn't wait for blueprints. People still made offerings. Dancers still performed in honor of the goddess. There was a temporary altar, sometimes surrounded by scaffolding or half-covered columns. Temple feasts were held in awkward spaces, and visitors made do with whatever portion of the sacred structure had been cleared of dust that week. It is worth remembering that temples in the ancient world were not just places of worship. They were economic centers, treasuries, and symbols of civic pride. When dignitaries came to Ephesus, they were often shown the temple, or rather, the parts of it that were presentable. A dignitary in the early 5th century BCE might be told, "Imagine, if you will, what this will look like once finished." And most of them nodded politely because they had temples under construction too. Still, there were frustrations. Stories survive of a few Ephesian citizens expressing irritation, not so much at the cost, which was immense, but at the length. Some saw it as a sign of the gods' displeasure. Others blamed foreign wars or internal corruption. There were even whispers that the temple might never be finished at all. But none of these voices gained traction. In times of drought, the people turned to Artemis. When plagues struck the region, they made new offerings at the dusty altar. And when wealthy Ephesians died, many left money in their wills to help finish the temple. It became a kind of generational project, a civic inheritance. Parents didn't just tell stories to their children. They passed down instructions on how to complete a certain section of the cornice or where the next frieze was to be mounted. And while that may seem tedious or even absurd, it was also remarkably human. People poured their lives into this building: sculptors, masons, architects, porters, and priests. Many of them died before seeing even a roof placed over the sanctuary. Some died staring at half-finished pediments. Others probably never even knew what the final plan was. It is believed that the final touches to the temple were completed around 323 BCE, nearly 127 years after the first trench had been dug. By that time, Alexander the Great was dead. His empire was being carved up. The classical age of Athens was long gone. And yet, in Ephesus, one could walk into a gleaming white temple, supported by over 100 Ionic columns, each 60 feet high, decorated with mythic scenes and bathed in the golden light of Anatolian sunsets. It was one of the largest temples ever built in the Greek world. Travelers placed it among the wonders of the ancient world, and those who had spent their lives building it might have paused, looked up at the finished roof, and quietly wondered, now that it's done, what do we do with all this time we used to spend building it? You might think that the grandest challenges of ancient Greek athletics involved strength, speed, or strategy. But if you had asked a participant in the 5th century BCE what really made the games difficult, you might have heard a different answer. The oil. The Greeks loved olive oil, not just for eating, but for bathing, massaging, sacrificing, anointing, and most famously, for covering the bodies of athletes before a competition. This wasn't some haphazard splash either. It was ritualized, practiced, and expected. A proper athlete was glossy. He shimmered in the sun. His skin glistened with a light reflecting sheen that announced discipline, training, and ideal manliness. But too much oil? That was a problem. Let's step back for a moment. The Pan-Hellenic Games, especially the Olympic, Isthmian, Nemean, and Pythian contests, were not just sporting events. They were sacred festivals. They honored the gods, Zeus at Olympia, Apollo at Delphi, and every aspect of the games had religious weight. The athletes competed nude not for scandal, but for purity and tradition. They represented the pinnacle of human form, perfected not by nature alone, but by years of training, sacrifice, and discipline. Olive oil played a central role in this culture. Young men rubbed it onto their skin before practice or competition. Trainers massaged it into sore muscles. Poets praised the sheen of a well-oiled competitor. It symbolized health, wealth, and sacred favor. And of course, athletes often scraped it off afterward with a curved tool called a strigil, collecting not only the oil, but also the dust and sweat of a good day's labor. In fact, this post-workout mixture, called gloios, was considered so potent that it was collected, bottled, and sometimes sold in the marketplace as a kind of medicinal goop. Yes, people paid money for the used oil scraped from athletes' skin. The ancient world had its own version of celebrity-endorsed health products. But the problem came during the events themselves. While training grounds had designated spaces for oiling, rubbing, and scraping, the actual arenas, the stadion for running, the palestra for wrestling, the dusty grounds for pankration, were not designed with oil in mind. These were simple dirt or sand surfaces, and when dozens of young men began their events shimmering like statues, it turned out that all that oil had consequences, especially in wrestling. Wrestling was one of the oldest and most respected events in the games. It was technical, graceful, and brutal. The goal was simple: throw your opponent to the ground 3 times. But doing that became increasingly difficult when both participants were essentially basted like roast lamb. The oil made it harder to grip, to lock arms, to hold a pin. Even the famed wrestling trainers, Paides Tribontes, who specialized in teaching leverage and technique, complained of over-oiling as a competitive disadvantage. Some athletes began oiling themselves less, hoping for a firmer grip. Others kept oiling heavily, relying on slipperiness to escape holds. Trainers argued, judges, or Hellenodikai, debated whether excessive oil gave unfair advantage. No formal rule was established, but it became a point of discussion, one of many small problems that history rarely records, but real people genuinely cared about. It got worse in pankration. Pankration was a no-holds-barred combination of wrestling and boxing. You could punch, kick, trip, choke, and lock limbs. Only biting and eye gouging were banned, and even then, enforcement was inconsistent. Pankration was a test of pain tolerance, strategy, and endurance. Now imagine trying to grapple with a man who is covered in a film of oil, dust, and sweat, slipping in and out of your grip like an eel. Competitors fell without being struck. Joints slipped from locks. One judge described a match as 2 shadows flailing in a bowl of milk. And still, the oiling continued. There were deeper issues at play. Oil was expensive. Good olive oil, the kind used in sacred or athletic contexts, came from specific regions like Attica or Lesbos. To be well-oiled was to show wealth, sponsorship, or the backing of a gymnasium. Poorer athletes sometimes used less oil, or worse, cheap substitutes. Some tried animal fat, which smelled and spoiled quickly. Others showed up dry, hoping skill would outweigh sheen, but audiences noticed. and in a culture where appearance was tightly bound to honor, an unoiled athlete might be seen as unprepared or, worse, unworthy. This led to some odd behavior. Athletes who couldn't afford premium oil borrowed it, stole it, or watered it down. There are minor surviving references to oil cutting, diluting good oil to stretch it further. And there are even inscriptions warning against the theft of oil from public gymnasia. Then there were the accidents. At the Isthmian Games, held near the sea, there were incidents of athletes slipping not from physical blows, but from a patch of residual oil left on the sand. One famous runner, nicknamed the Eel of Aegina, was said to have fallen just meters before the finish line after slipping on an oily patch. His opponent passed him by, victorious but slightly embarrassed. Another record, less poetic but more bureaucratic, shows an early attempt to restrict oiling before events. A magistrate from Nemea issued a decree requiring athletes to scrape down fully before entering the ring. It didn't last. Public backlash was fierce. The practice of oiling had too much tradition. It had become ceremonial, symbolic, almost sacred. So they compromised. Wrestlers could scrape before entering the ring, but only lightly. Oil was still applied beforehand. Everyone pretended it was just enough. And so the games continued, gleaming, slipping, struggling. For the modern observer, it might seem absurd. Entire contests affected not by tactics or strength, but by the slipperiness of competitors. But that's the beauty of boring history. It reminds us that the small things, texture, tradition, and even vanity, shaped outcomes just as much as grand ideals. And it leaves us wondering how much greatness slipped away, not because of weakness or fate, but simply because someone overdid it with the olive oil. So there it stood. At last, the temple of Artemis at Ephesus, after over a century of chiseling, hauling, adjusting, and waiting, finally stood complete. Ivory and gold adorned the altar. Great tapestries hung between carved lintels. Incense drifted through the sanctuary. Pilgrims came from across the known world to admire it, worship in it, and often compare it to temples back home. For a brief window in time, Ephesus held the distinction of being the proud home of one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. The temple wasn't just a religious space anymore. It was a statement, a symbol, a destination. Artists traveled to it, philosophers referenced it, and some, like the Greek geographer Pausanias, simply listed it as one of those things every civilized person should witness before they die. The economy of Ephesus grew with it. Vendors lined the approach to the temple. Offerings flowed in from distant cities, along with coins and carved statuettes. High festivals brought in food sellers, potters, and musicians. Artemis, now celebrated in full Ephesian glory, had a home that matched her complex, layered identity. Part fertility goddess, part virgin huntress, part civic symbol. And yet, the glory didn't last. On a summer night in 356 BCE, just months before Alexander the Great was born, a man named Herostratus set fire to the temple. We don't know much about Herostratus, but we know why he did it. According to ancient sources, he wanted to be remembered. Fame at any cost. He set fire to the temple's wooden roof beams, knowing that the marble structure couldn't survive such intense heat. The flames spread quickly. By morning, much of the roof was gone. Columns had cracked. Statues had melted into sad lumps of lead and gold. The inner sanctum, once alive with prayer, was now smoke-blackened and silent. The citizens of Ephesus were devastated. Their sacred project, spanning generations, had collapsed in a single night. Herostratus was captured, tortured, and executed. His name was forbidden to be spoken. And yet, ironically, it survives, recorded by those who disobeyed the ban, ensuring he achieved precisely what he had sought: eternal infamy. But the people of Ephesus did not give up. They rebuilt. In fact, the second temple of Artemis was even grander than the first, wider, taller, more intricately decorated. Alexander the Great himself offered to fund the reconstruction, although the city tactfully declined, choosing instead to preserve civic ownership of the sacred space. They began again, this time using more fire-resistant materials. New sculptors were brought in. Columns were imported. Artisans from all over Ionia contributed. And once again, the project took decades. This time, however, it stood longer. The rebuilt temple survived wars, political change, and even Roman annexation. It remained a revered site well into the Roman imperial period. Emperors made dedications. Coins were minted with its likeness. Tourists, Roman aristocrats and scholars, continued to arrive. And Artemis endured too in her Ephesian form, blending more and more with Roman interpretations of Diana. But history, like all things, wears away at marble. By the 3rd century CE, as Christianity spread and civic interest in pagan temples waned, the once great temple of Artemis fell into gradual disuse. Some say it was destroyed by a Christian mob. Others argue it was abandoned, its columns quarried for use in later buildings, including churches and palaces. By the time the Byzantine Empire rose in the east, little remained. A few scattered stones, some cracked statues, an occasional foundation wall peeking through grass. Today, the site of the temple is mostly quiet. You can visit it. There's a column, mostly reconstructed, rising from a marshy field. A stork often nests on top. Nearby, you'll find some broken capitals, a few carved stones half sunk into earth, and a museum down the road with some of the recovered fragments. It doesn't look like much, and yet, if you stand there long enough among the reeds and stones, you might hear it. Not voices, but effort, time, patience, the echo of footsteps carrying marble, the murmurs of plans revised and re-revised, the quiet certainty of people working on something they would never live to see completed. Because for the people of Ephesus, the Temple of Artemis was never just a building. It was a lesson, one carved in stone, rebuilt in fire, and forgotten only because time forgets everything eventually. Still, it makes you wonder, how many other wonders, unfinished, half buried or burned, are waiting beneath our feet, telling stories we've simply stopped listening to. Hey there, sleepy historians. Before we begin, take a moment to gently tap the like button. Maybe subscribe if you enjoy dozing off to forgotten tales. And let us know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. Now, settle in. Let's begin our slow drift through the less glamorous, yet still deeply human corners of ancient Greek mythology. It begins, as these things often do, not with a dramatic pronouncement or divine vision, but with a committee. You see, when the people of Ephesus first considered building a temple to honor Artemis, they were not seeking grandeur. They were looking mostly to not be left out. The Ionian cities were always in mild competition. One city had an amphitheater carved into a hillside. Another, a clever harbor improvement project that prevented silt from ruining trade. And Ephesus, watching this regional arms race of civic pride, thought perhaps it should do something equally impressive. A temple. A large one. For Artemis. The goddess Artemis, twin sister of Apollo and protector of wild things, was revered in Ephesus in a particularly regional flavor. Unlike the sleek, bow-wielding maiden of the Homeric tradition, the Ephesian Artemis resembled a fertility goddess, adorned with rounded, possibly symbolic shapes across her chest, interpreted variously as eggs, gourds, or, less politely, breasts. Whatever the case, she was theirs, and they would give her a temple. It was the mid-6th century BCE, and the initial planning began slowly. First, they had to select a site. This was done by a combination of augury, local geography, and a vague sense of convenience. The spot chosen was low-lying near the Cayster River, a place where the soil was soft, ideal for digging. This was also, unfortunately, a place prone to flooding. But that was a problem for later. Then came the funding. As you might expect, the people of Ephesus had limited public funds. Temples were not cheap, especially ones meant to rival those of Athens or Delphi. So the city fathers turned to wealthy patrons. One of them was a man named Croesus, the famously rich king of Lydia. He had been conquered by Cyrus the Great, but not before making several large and symbolic donations to temples across the Greek world. The Temple of Artemis was among the beneficiaries. The design was entrusted to a Cretan architect named Chersiphron and his son, Metagenes. The early plans included over 100 marble columns, each about 60 feet tall. The whole structure would stand on a raised platform to help with flooding. But even so, progress was slow. Marble had to be quarried and moved overland using oxen and wooden rollers. The soft earth made transporting the columns treacherous. The stones would sink or tip. Chersiphron, who was not only an architect but also a practical man, devised a clever method. He designed a system where the columns could be rotated and rolled like massive drums. This, he hoped, would speed up the process. It didn't. A flood soon swept through the construction site, turning months of work into a soggy mess. Foundation trenches filled with water. Earthworks collapsed. Some of the marble cracked or vanished entirely under the muddy ground. Artemis, it seemed, was either testing their devotion or displaying the fickle temper of a local river spirit. But they didn't give up. Years passed, decades in fact. Work would stop during wars, famines, and citywide budget crises. Skilled laborers would leave for better-paying jobs in Miletus or Corinth. Chersiphron died. Metagenes continued. He died too. Other architects came and went. New foundations were laid. Columns rose, then collapsed, then rose again. By the time one generation of Ephesians had grown old and died, their children were just beginning to see the skeleton of a great temple take shape. The structure was beginning to rise out of the swampy plain like a ghost of something not yet real. Marble gleamed under the Anatolian sun, but there was still no roof, no statues, no altars, just an eternal work in progress. From a modern perspective, it's hard to imagine a construction timeline that long. But in antiquity, time moved differently. Projects spanned lifetimes. Entire civic identities were tied to things that wouldn't be completed until your grandchildren were old. And still, they built. Imagine being a young Ephesian laborer, hauling stone up wooden ramps, hearing your grandfather say, "This is the same block we moved when I was your age." Imagine being a priest of Artemis, conducting rites on a temporary altar for 40 years, always saying, "Soon the real temple will be ready." If there was one place in ancient Greece that understood the true burden of oil, it was the Apoditirion, the changing room of the gymnasium. It was here that athletes began and ended their rituals of preparation. Sandals were removed, tunics were folded and placed into woven baskets, and beside each pile of clothing, usually resting on a small wooden bench or low stone shelf, you'd find a strigil, that signature curved blade of bronze, sometimes iron, sometimes bone. It looked simple, like a flattened question mark, but it was the most important tool a competitor carried, besides his body. The strigil was used to scrape off olive oil after training. Not only was this considered hygienic, but it also had economic value. As mentioned before, the gloopy mixture of oil, dust, and sweat, gloios, was collected in small vessels, sometimes sold by the amphora. Some of this was used in dubious folk remedies, others in what we might today call healing salves. Whether it worked is irrelevant. What mattered was belief. Some strigils were personalized, carved with initials, decorated with etchings of athletic events. A few bore inscriptions that translated to things like, "To my son, may you win," or "Strength comes slowly." They were personal tools, but also shared commodities. In busier gymnasia, boys might rent or borrow them. More enterprising youths sold scrapings to local apothecaries or itinerant healers. Oil, in this context, was not only a substance, it was a system. As the Pan-Hellenic Games grew in reputation, so too did the oil economy. Vendors stationed themselves near gymnasia, selling aribaloi, small round flasks of oil that could be hung from the wrist or looped on a belt. These were often made of terracotta, glass, or metal. Fancier ones were silver or ivory. You could spot a serious athlete by the weight of his aribalos. Some athletes brought their own oil from home. Others relied on the generosity of trainers, sponsors, or civic patrons. In Athens, the state sometimes distributed olive oil from sacred groves as prizes in the Panathenaic Games. Not just jars of oil, but jars beautifully decorated with black figure illustrations of Athena on one side and athletic contests on the other. These were practical and prestigious. This prize oil was stored in Panathenaic amphorae, huge containers that could hold over 40 liters each. Winning one was like coming home with a trophy and a year's supply of cooking oil at once. But for competitors traveling to places like Delphi or Nemea, oil had to be purchased locally, unless you had pack animals, slaves, or a very patient uncle. That's where sponge sellers came in. If oil was step one, the sponge was step two. Used after the strigil, sponges were soaked in warm water and applied to the skin. Vendors sold them outside training grounds, alongside sand, towels, and even muscle salves made from goat fat and herbs. A full cleaning kit might include oil, strigil, sponge, and soft cloth. The wealthier the athlete, the more refined their post-competition regimen. There was even a market for second-hand gloyos, collected in vats. Trainers claimed certain athletes had more healing sweat than others. Athenian records show that small vials of this oil dust mixture were sold as ointments for bruises, stiff joints, or even indigestion, though it's unclear if anyone truly benefited, besides the sellers. In the midst of this slippery economy, the judges, the Hellanodikai, tried to maintain order. Before each event, athletes would undergo a dokimasia, a brief inspection to confirm their eligibility, age, origin, physical health, no injuries, no deformities that might be exploited, and in theory, no unfair oils or foreign substances. But enforcement varied. Some judges were more ceremonial, others were sticklers. A few tried to impose oil limits, even instituting impromptu scrapings. At Olympia, one such crackdown led to complaints from a faction of Corinthian athletes who claimed that being scraped twice in one day robbed them of their vital gloss. No punishment was issued, but the judge's name did not appear on the next roster. There was also the matter of sand. Oil and sand were often used together, sand sprinkled lightly after oiling to absorb excess and give texture. This created a sort of natural grip, but oversanding could irritate the skin, cause rashes, or trap dirt. Too little sand, and the oil made you shine like a statue, but slide like one too. Some gymnasia had preferred ratios. Trainers argued endlessly. Should the sand be coarse or fine? Should it be sprinkled wet or dry? Was it better to apply it in stripes or patches? None of these debates made it into the grand histories. You won't find Thucydides musing on sand quality. But in the real dusty spaces of athletic life, these details mattered. By the late classical period, oiling rituals had become codified across the Greek world. Every serious athlete had a routine, and every city-state had its oil preferences. In Sparta, where modesty and toughness were cultural obsessions, some athletes oiled lightly, enough to show discipline, but not vanity. In Athens, where beauty and appearance were celebrated, the gloss mattered more. Corinth was known for flashy presentation, Thebes for practical technique. But the one thing they all agreed on, oil could win or lose a match. And so the slippery dance continued. Grapplers struggled to lock a hold. Sprinters slipped at the starting line. Boxers missed a punch by a hair's breadth when a sweaty shoulder twisted away. And somewhere behind them, a sponge vendor counted his coins and waited for the next match to begin. Because in ancient Greece, even in the pursuit of glory, the real question was often less philosophical and more practical. How much oil is too much? Before the gods themselves start to laugh. By the time Roman tourists began frequenting Greece in the 1st century BCE, they found the athletic rituals both impressive and a little odd. The olive oil customs were still intact, if slightly more commercialized. The games continued, though with a bit more pomp, and the athletes remained impressively glossy. Some Roman writers, like Pliny the Elder, noted the strange obsession with oiling and scraping. He remarked, almost with amusement, that Greek athletes would anoint themselves, compete, and then remove it all again as if it never mattered. But that missed the point entirely. For the Greeks, the oil wasn't merely decorative. It was sacred, ritual, part of an identity. One indication of this is how the oiling tradition persisted long after the athletes themselves had been forgotten. Statues of famous competitors, some life-size, others larger, line the walkways of sanctuaries like Olympia and Delphi. Many were inscribed with the names of the victors, the cities they represented, and the number of times they'd won. These statues weren't just public monuments. They became interactive spaces of memory, and some, interestingly, were rubbed smooth by the hands of later admirers. We know from sources like Pausanias that it became common for visitors, especially fellow athletes or pious spectators, to rub the feet or thighs of these statues, as if hoping to absorb a sliver of the athlete's former glory. Oil was sometimes used in the process. They would anoint the statue just as the original man had anointed himself, not to prepare for combat, but to connect with the divine echo of excellence. A few statues even developed polished patches, surfaces so worn by generations of reverent rubbing that the stone glowed. This tells us something crucial. Even centuries after the original competitions, the rituals surrounding olive oil, application, removal, veneration, retained cultural power. They weren't just customs. They were connections to an idealized past. But like all things, the gleam faded. By the 3rd century CE, the decline of traditional pagan practices across the empire began to impact athletic life. Funding for games dried up. Sacred groves were cut down or repurposed. The gymnasia remained for a while, still filled with young men and aging trainers, but they became increasingly detached from civic or religious life. When Christianity began to dominate public institutions, the naked competitions, the oiling rituals, and the strigal scrapings were viewed with suspicion, not because they were pagan per se, but because they represented an older world, one obsessed with the body, the public display of flesh, and a culture that prioritized form and function over humility and piety. Many gymnasia were closed. The Pan-Hellenic Games were held less often or fell into disrepair, and the oil, that sacred, ordinary, complex substance, slid quietly out of the picture. By the 4th century, the games at Olympia had officially ended. The stadiums were left to erode. The temples were looted or crumbled under earthquakes. Olive oil, of course, remained central to Mediterranean life, but its sacred athletic role faded. No one oiled up to honor Zeus anymore. No sponge vendors lined the path to the palestra. No boys in training scraped gloios into clay jars to sell in the agora. Only the statues remained, some toppled, some buried, a few preserved. And occasionally, archaeologists uncover those strigils, slender, curved blades lying in the dust of forgotten gymnasia. When they're found, they're usually corroded, bent, and unimpressive to look at. But they are artifacts of a deeply human problem: the balance between tradition, identity, and practicality. Because for all the lofty ideals of Hellenic excellence, the pursuit of glory, the honor of the polis, the sacred bond between body and God, there was also the daily concern. Too much oil, and you might lose the match. Too little, and you might lose respect. So they kept rubbing, kept scraping, kept slipping. And today, when we marvel at marble statues of athletes, smooth as sea-washed stones, it's easy to forget they once struggled with things as mundane and maddening as greasy hands, sweaty feet, and gritty dust sticking to awkward places. Maybe, in the end, the glory of the games wasn't in winning, but in managing not to slide face first into the dirt. Which raises the question, what other great legacies of civilization were shaped not by bold strategy or fate, but by someone trying not to fall flat on their oiled-up backside? His name was Hermes. It began with a theft, not by a desperate farmer or a starving soldier, not even by a seasoned trickster with debts to pay. No, this theft was committed by a newborn, a baby barely a day old, still swaddled in divine afterbirth and wrapped in the faint, strange scent of Olympus. He had not yet opened both eyes, and yet he was already plotting. He was the son of Zeus and Maia, born in a hidden cave on Mount Selene, far from the noise and politics of Olympus. Maia was a nymph of quiet disposition. She'd chosen seclusion to raise her child in peace. But Hermes, it turned out, had no interest in staying quiet for long. According to the Homeric hymn to Hermes, he was up and walking the same day he was born. Not just toddling either, striding, looking for adventure. And by the time the sun had set on his first day of life, he had already invented the lyre and stolen a herd of sacred cattle. This was not exactly the divine behavior Maia had hoped for. Let's start with the lyre. Early in the day, Hermes wandered out of his cave and came across a tortoise. Rather than marvel at its gentle pace or admire its hard shell, he did what any mythological entrepreneur might do. He turned it into a musical instrument. He hollowed out the shell, stretched strings across it, and, according to the hymn, created the first notes of the lyre. It was a haunting, twanging sound, the kind of music no one had ever heard before. With a few adjustments, some reeds here, a stretched gut string there, he crafted a fully functioning instrument before the gods even realized he existed. But music was only the warm-up act. That night, Hermes turned his attention toward business. And by business, of course, we mean cattle rustling. Specifically, he stole the sacred cattle of Apollo, his older half-brother, the sun god, the archer, the musician, the beautiful. Hermes apparently had little patience for divine hierarchies. To him, Apollo's status meant nothing. He saw a herd of livestock and decided to see what would happen if it went missing. But Hermes wasn't careless. He didn't simply walk up to the cattle and lead them off like some naive shepherd. He plotted, he prepared, and most importantly, he devised a plan to hide his tracks. He reversed the hooves. You see, Hermes led the cattle backward so that the hoof prints pointed in the opposite direction. He also wore mismatched sandals, one made of bark, one of woven grass, so that anyone tracking him would be thoroughly confused. And for good measure, he walked part of the way backward himself, cradling the lyre and humming. It was elaborate, unnecessary perhaps, but it was clever, and Hermes was already showing the signs of becoming something the Greek pantheon didn't quite know what to do with. A god of trade, travel, communication, and deception. He hid the cattle in a cave near Pylos and slaughtered just 2, offering them as a sacrifice to the 12 Olympian gods. Notably, He included himself among them, a bold move for a one-day-old deity. Then, quietly, he slipped back to Mount Selene. He returned to his cradle, wrapped himself up like an innocent, cooed a little, and waited. Of course, Apollo noticed. Gods always notice when their cattle go missing. It's a rule of myth. And when he did, Apollo stormed across the Greek countryside, following faint clues and confusing footprints, growing angrier by the step. When he arrived at Maia's cave, Hermes pretended to be asleep. When questioned, he claimed ignorance. After all, what could a newborn possibly know about cattle? He didn't even know what cattle were. Apollo was not amused. He dragged the baby god to Olympus. Before the whole divine assembly, he laid out his case: deception, theft, sacrilege. Hermes, of course, denied everything with wide eyes and clever words. He played coy. Then, when that didn't work, he began to charm, literally. He brought out the lyre and began to play. The sound, unlike anything Olympus had heard, cut through the tension. Apollo, who had mastered the kithara and whose musical pride ran deep, was stunned. He listened, and slowly, he softened. The notes, though simple, had a strange, joyful honesty. Hermes offered the lyre to Apollo as a gift, an apology of sorts, a barter. In exchange, he asked for one thing: forgiveness, and maybe a few smaller roles in the pantheon, like messenger of the gods, protector of travelers, and intermediary of deals, however shady they might be. Apollo agreed. And just like that, Hermes wasn't just forgiven. He was promoted. The theft had worked, not because it was undetected, but because it was negotiated. Apollo got music, Hermes got a position, the cattle were returned, most of them, and Zeus, watching from his throne, reportedly chuckled. Thus was born the first divine trade scam, a mixture of theft, charm, innovation, and haggling. The kind of deal that shaped not only myths, but marketplaces. But even in this light-hearted tale, one can sense something deeper, a question that remains unresolved. In a world ruled by power, was Hermes right to trade his way in through trickery? Or did he simply do what everyone else was doing, just better, on Olympus? Even the gods needed a good deal every now and then. And that's precisely what Hermes had just delivered. After a single day of existence, barely long enough to be swaddled properly, Hermes had managed to commit theft, mislead a god, invent a musical instrument, and secure a position on Mount Olympus. He had not earned his place through heroism, prophecy, or thunderbolts. He had earned it through the delicate art of bargaining. Apollo, in the end, was not angry. Not really. He was intrigued. The lyre Hermes had given him was unlike anything in the Olympian soundscape. Its strings, made of sheep gut and strung over a tortoise shell, sang with a kind of wild rhythm that appealed to Apollo's love of order through artistry. He didn't just accept the gift, he was delighted. And Hermes, ever attuned to tone, timing, and perception, had seen that coming. This was not the last time Hermes would use a gift to smooth over a problem. Not long after, he would invent another instrument, the panpipes, and give those to another god, Pan, and later to Apollo again, in exchange for future goodwill. He began establishing a reputation, not just as a trickster, but as someone who understood value. And more importantly, someone who could assign value where none had previously existed. It's easy to forget, in a world of modern trade agreements and fine print, that ancient myths offer early glimpses into how humans imagined the first rules of commerce. Hermes, in myth, was the first being to ask, "What is this thing worth, and to whom?" The cattle was sacred to Apollo, but only because they were said to have belonged to him. Hermes didn't see them as sacred. He saw them as leverage, useful, powerful, symbolic. He didn't need to own them. He only needed them long enough to change the conversation. And that's exactly what happened. After the confrontation on Olympus, Zeus watched his youngest son with growing interest. While other gods bickered over domains, Poseidon over the seas, Hades over the underworld, Hermes maneuvered sideways. He didn't want dominion. He wanted mobility. Zeus, ever fond of cleverness, especially when it mirrored his own, granted Hermes a new role, herald and messenger of the gods. It sounded ceremonial, but it was much more. Hermes would now be the one to negotiate between gods and mortals, to deliver orders, escort souls, and carry sacred objects. His sandals would be winged. His staff, the caduceus, would become a symbol of peace, trade, and the fine line between lies and truths. And most significantly, he would govern boundaries, not just geographical ones, like borders between regions, but conceptual ones, the space between life and death, between gods and mortals, between promises and the enforcement of promises. Hermes became the god of contracts, of exchanges, of commerce. In short, he became the god of deals. This may sound grand, but Hermes' real power was in the boring, everyday matters that made society function, ensuring two parties agreed to terms, delivering a message without bias, ensuring that goods made it from port to market unmolested by pirates or fraud. His influence seeped into the routines of merchants, travelers, and thieves alike. On the doors of ancient Greek homes, people would hang little offerings to Hermes, not because they feared him, but because they respected what he represented. The smooth flow of action, negotiation, and outcome. Back in the myth, the theft of the cattle fades quickly from scandal into origin story. Apollo, now quite pleased with his new lyre, offered Hermes something else in return. A set of oracular stones, used in divination, said to carry prophetic energy. It wasn't a fair trade by any strict measure. A musical instrument for divine insight? But again, Hermes had something else in mind. He didn't want to become a seer. That role was too fixed, too still. Instead, he took the stones and used them to influence communication itself, shaping how omens were read, how messages were delivered, and how words could be used to bend fate. Apollo and Hermes, oddly enough, became friends. Their relationship became the model for a kind of Olympian partnership, one god representing ideal truth and light, the other clever ambiguity and motion. Apollo spoke plainly, Hermes spun it sideways. Together, they embodied a full spectrum of communication. This harmony would become crucial in later myths, when gods argued, when oaths were sworn, or when mortals needed guidance without the booming wrath of Zeus. If you couldn't pray to Apollo for clarity, you whispered to Hermes for help navigating the gray areas. The lesson here, so quietly embedded in the hymn, isn't about right or wrong. It's about function. Hermes took what existed, cattle, lyres, sandals, and redefined them, He used appearances, a baby can't be a thief, to mask intentions, and he left just enough ambiguity in every action to make sure he always had room to negotiate. It wasn't theft for theft's sake. It was a proof of concept. The gods, for all their might, had not yet developed the one thing humans needed most, a structure for dealing with each other. And so, a newborn god invented it. He lied, but made it artful. He stole, but gave something better in return. He confused the powerful, but made them laugh. And in the end, Olympus didn't just tolerate him, it needed him. Because while Zeus ruled by thunder, Poseidon by flood, and Hades by finality, Hermes ruled the space in between, the invisible threads of trust, transaction, and travel. Still, it leaves us wondering, if the first contract was born from a con, does that mean all human agreements are just well-managed misunderstandings? Hermes never built a temple as grand as Zeus's in Olympia, nor did he have sacred groves like Apollo at Delphi. There were no massive cult centers with oracles mumbling in ecstatic trances on his behalf. But if you walked the old roads of ancient Greece, those dusty, winding tracks that ran from city to city, village to vineyard, you would see him everywhere. He was marked not by marble or bronze, but by a simple pile of stones, a hermaion, they called it, a small heap, often with a carved post or a crude head mounted on top. These were the roadside shrines of Hermes, the wayfarer, the boundary marker, the messenger, the god of in-betweens. Travelers would drop a pebble on the pile as they passed. Some said it was for good luck. Others, that it was a way of saying, I made it this far. The gesture was so ordinary, so boring, that ancient authors rarely described it in detail. But these heaps added up, and in doing so, they silently mapped out the entire network of human movement in the Greek world. In that sense, Hermes became something more than divine. He became infrastructural. After the cattle episode and his formal introduction to Olympus, Hermes settled into his role. But settling for Hermes meant constantly moving. He delivered messages for Zeus. He escorted the souls of the dead to the underworld. He mediated arguments between gods and mortals. He was present in myths, big and small, guiding Odysseus to safety, warning Perseus before his journey to slay Medusa, and even intervening in the story of Pandora by helping distribute the gods' gifts. He was never the loudest or most violent figure in these tales, but he was always essential. And often, he was the only one who listened. While other gods demanded worship and obedience, Hermes offered something closer to understanding. He knew that humans lied, that they got lost, that they broke deals, bent the rules, and sometimes just needed a bit of room to maneuver. That's why he was the god not only of merchants, but of thieves. To modern ears, that might sound contradictory, but to the Greeks, it made perfect sense. Commerce and theft are not opposites. They're both about getting something from someone else. The difference is in the method, not the motive. Hermes didn't judge. He simply understood the logic of both. And perhaps that's what made him so beloved. Not for glory or terror, but for his relatability. He wasn't above playing tricks. He didn't pretend to be noble all the time. He wore mismatched sandals, snuck out of his cradle and outwitted gods old enough to be his great-grandparents. And when mortals whispered his name, it wasn't in fear or awe. It was usually with a shrug and a hopeful glance down the road. Help me get there safely, and if I make a small mistake on the way, look the other way, won't you? There's another odd little legacy to consider. In Roman times, Hermes became Mercury, the swift-footed, smooth-talking messenger of Latin myth. The Romans gave him fancier wings, sharper tools, and eventually his name to the fastest-moving planet in the sky. But they also absorbed his role in contracts. Roman businessmen would make offerings to Mercury before sealing deals. He was invoked not to ensure honesty, but to ensure the deal itself happened smoothly. They knew that no contract is ever perfect, that misunderstanding and loophole were part of the game, and so they asked the god of elegant trickery to help manage that chaos, not eliminate it. Today, if you visit ancient ruins, whether in Greece, Turkey, or southern Italy, you may still spot his image, not as a thunder-wielding god or a statue on a mountain, but carved onto coins, painted on shop walls, scribbled into the corners of legal documents. And of course, there are the Hermae, those odd little stone posts with carved heads and unadorned square bodies, once placed at crossroads and property lines, often with exaggerated features, a crude joke in stone. They're strange looking now, but they were loved, because Hermes was the god who didn't mind being ridiculous, so long as it got him and you where you needed to go. So in the end, the story of the stolen cattle wasn't really about livestock or sandals or even music. It was about negotiation, not just between gods, but between possibility and permission. Hermes didn't wait to be granted a place in the world. He created a moment of tension and then used it to offer value. He proved quietly what every good merchant, traveler, and storyteller knows. If you can understand someone else's desire, even a god's, you can offer them something they didn't know they wanted. And if you do that well enough, you'll always be welcome, even if you came in by the side door. Still, it makes you wonder how many of the rules we live by started not from law, but from a clever child seeing what he could get away with. There's an old saying attributed to the Spartans: a man who sits too long forgets how to stand. It's likely apocryphal, but in the case of ancient Sparta, even apocryphal sayings have a way of telling the truth. Sparta, or Lacedaemon, as it was known in its own time, was famous or infamous for its obsession with discipline, austerity, and the calculated suppression of comfort. Its people trained from childhood to be warriors. Its elders governed through silence and presence rather than speeches and robes. And perhaps most peculiarly of all, Sparta developed a subtle but powerful contempt for sitting. Not for a moment of rest here or there, but for the kind of settled, relaxed, body-slumping posture that might suggest you had nothing better to do. Comfort, to the Spartan mind, was a danger. It dulled the senses, slowed the reflexes, and encouraged indulgence. And so, by custom, if not formal law, Spartans stood. Let's be clear, There was no universal decree that banned chairs entirely from Sparta. Archaeology reveals that stools, benches, and even carved thrones existed in Laconia, the broader region of Spartan control. But inside Sparta itself, among the homoioi, the equals, the full male citizens, sitting was rarely seen in public life. There are fragments from ancient historians and later commentators that hint at a consistent pattern. Spartan men stood during assemblies, dined upright, and even endured long public addresses on their feet. The exception? The Gerousia, the Council of Elders. These men, usually over the age of 60, were permitted to sit during deliberation not because of privilege, but because of necessity. Age, even in Sparta, eventually wears down the knees. But for everyone else, standing was a matter of virtue. There are mentions in Plutarch's sayings of the Spartans where visiting ambassadors from Athens or Corinth would grow weary from hours of discussion, while the Spartans, silent and unmoving, remained upright and unfazed. When one foreign diplomat, unused to the Spartan custom, asked why there were no seats in the assembly chamber, a Spartan commander allegedly replied, "We come here to decide what must be done, not to grow soft doing it." It sounds harsh. It is harsh, but that was the point. This distaste for sitting extended to education. The Spartan agoge, the state-sponsored training program for boys, began at age 7 and lasted until about age 20. During this time, boys were deliberately subjected to hunger, cold, physical pain, and boredom, all to train endurance and obedience. Sitting, particularly in a casual or comfortable posture, was frowned upon. Slouching was corrected with rods. Leaning against walls earned discipline. Even during instruction, boys would often stand in rows, alert, unmoving, while being quizzed on matters of warfare, ethics, or oratory. And while other Greek cities prided themselves on teaching geometry or music, the Spartans focused on brevity and posture. They trained their boys to speak concisely and to carry themselves like spears, upright, straight, and deadly. In one anecdote, a visiting poet attempted to teach rhythm and meter to a Spartan class. After an hour, the instructor noticed that not a single student had sat. When he asked why, the youngest replied, "So that our minds remain as sharp as our legs." Even meal times reflected this ethic. The famous syssitia, the communal meals shared by Spartan citizens, were held in austere dining halls. Meals were simple: black broth, barley cakes, sometimes meat or cheese. But what made these meals remarkable was the posture. Men ate upright, sometimes standing, sometimes perched briefly on low stools without backs. There are references to benches, but they were intentionally narrow and flat. No cushions, no slouching, and certainly no reclining in the style of Athenian symposia, where men lounged and debated over wine. To the Spartans, reclining to dine was not only indulgent, it was foreign. When a Spartan youth once returned from an embassy to Athens and was observed sitting cross-legged in the agora, an elder pulled him aside and asked if he had learned to speak better or merely to sit lazier. There's no record of the youth's response, but given Spartan standards, it's safe to assume he stood up quickly. But perhaps the most curious part of Sparta's anti-sitting attitude was that it wasn't about chairs themselves. Sparta had carpenters. They had wood, They built stools and storage and furniture like any other city-state. What they rejected was not the object, but the impulse behind it. Sitting in their worldview was a symbol of self-prioritization, a softening, a belief that comfort was something to pursue rather than something to resist. In the harsh logic of Sparta, a man who sought ease had already begun to lose the war before it had even begun. Of course, this raises deeper questions. Was this posture of discipline truly effective? Did standing through a speech make your judgment better? Did refusing to recline at dinner make you stronger in battle? Or did it merely make you tired? These are questions that historians still debate. Some admire Sparta's discipline. Others note how their obsession with austerity led to stagnation. But one thing is clear. In a world where chairs were seen as harmless, Sparta turned sitting into a philosophical problem. And that leaves us wondering, when does rejecting comfort make you strong? And when does it simply make you strange? It's worth pausing just for a moment to imagine the shape of a Spartan city square. No bustling market stalls, no chatter, no wandering poets with scrolls tucked under their arms. Instead, a stillness. Men standing in clusters, arms folded, backs straight, with only the occasional nod or short reply. No benches, no marble colonnades to lean against. Just open space and quiet tension, like the whole city had learned to balance on the balls of its feet. To visitors, the silence could be disconcerting, even absurd. In Athens, the agora was full of seated debates and reclining philosophers. In Corinth, people lounged on cushions discussing sculpture, trade, and naval design. But in Sparta, people didn't settle. Not in the bodily sense, not in the political one either. Let's talk about posture and power. Among the Spartan elite, the homoioi, or equals, standing was a social signal, not just of readiness, but of restraint. A man who stood through a meeting without wavering was seen as one who could be trusted in battle, one who shifted, fidgeted, or sought a stool. That man's reliability, while not explicitly questioned, was noted. There was no formal punishment for sitting, no law carved in stone forbidding chairs. But there was something far more effective in shaping behavior: cultural mockery. Spartans didn't write laws about every detail. They transmitted expectations through gestures, habits, and the harsh clarity of public example. If a young man sat too soon or too often, he might find his invitations to communal meals reduced. He might be placed at the edge of formations during training. He might find himself excluded from those brief, rare nods of respect passed between elders and youths. Standing became its own kind of currency. There's a passage in Plutarch where a Spartan was asked why their young men were always so still, so straight-backed, even when doing nothing. He replied, "So that, even doing nothing, we do something." To a culture shaped by scarcity, of food, of speech, of excess, stillness was not passive. It was its own form of effort. And then there's the furniture itself. Spartan homes, when archaeologically examined, appear shockingly simple, almost bleak. Clay floors, sparse decoration, minimal storage, and when seating is found, It is often in the form of low stools or rough benches, sometimes built into the walls themselves. Athenian pottery, by contrast, is filled with images of chairs, elegant klizmos chairs with curved legs, padded cushions, and elaborate design. But Spartan imagery avoids such decoration almost entirely. There's even a curious anecdote recorded centuries later, in which a Spartan craftsman was offered a commission to build a lavish, reclining couch for a wealthy merchant from Thessaly. The Spartan allegedly declined, saying, "I make furniture for the spine, not for the stomach." It might be apocryphal. But like most Spartan sayings, even the fakes reflect something real. To the Spartan mind, furniture that cradled the body invited decay. A curved back, a softened seat, these were signs of moral slippage. A chair wasn't just a place to sit, it was a warning. This didn't stop visitors from bringing chairs, of course. When foreign dignitaries came to negotiate, they often arrived with portable thrones, folding stools, or leather-wrapped seats carried by servants. And they used them. But in doing so, they marked themselves as outsiders. Spartan hosts, meanwhile, would remain standing, always. There's a brief note in Xenophon that describes a tense diplomatic meeting between a Persian envoy and a Spartan ephor. The envoy sat cross-legged, fanning himself with a painted cloth. The ephor remained standing in the heat. He didn't speak for several minutes, and when he finally did, he said simply, "You may rest now, but we will remember that you did." That was all. But for a Spartan, that was enough. It's easy, from a modern perspective, to view all of this as performative extremism. And in many ways, it was. The aversion to chairs wasn't about ergonomics. It was about self-control, or at least the appearance of it. Sparta's identity rested on a fragile foundation. The idea that its citizens were harder, better, more disciplined than any others. But such a belief can't be proven on the battlefield alone. It needs constant daily reinforcement. And so, the body became the battleground. If the Athenians proved their sophistication through speech, and the Corinthians through wealth, the Spartans proved theirs through bodily discomfort. They didn't sit because they could endure standing. They ate poorly because they could survive on less. They spoke briefly because they believed most words were wasted. But this rigid approach came with a cost. As other Greek cities developed new philosophies, arts, and technologies, Sparta remained largely static. Their rejection of softness extended to curiosity, to complexity, and eventually to adaptability. By the time of the Hellenistic period, when Macedonian kings and Roman diplomats began reshaping the Mediterranean world, Sparta seemed increasingly like a living relic, a city more comfortable with old pain than new ideas. And so, when chairs did return, slowly, subtly, they came not with conquest, but with quiet erosion. Visitors brought them, foreign customs crept in, and eventually even the standing warriors sat. But the memory lingered. A stone bench found near the ruins of a Spartan dining hall bears no inscription, but it's smooth only on one side, likely where the elders sat. The rest remains rough, unworked, not because they lacked tools, but because they didn't see the point. So what do we take from this? Sparta's aversion to chairs might sound trivial, even laughable. But beneath it lies a question that haunts every society. When does comfort become corruption? The Spartans feared softness, not because it was bad, but because it was tempting. And they believed that the only way to avoid temptation was to never sit down in the first place. But perhaps there's another lesson buried in the dust of those stone floors. You can't outrun weariness forever. Eventually, even the strongest need a place to rest. The question is, what kind of rest leaves you stronger when you rise again? By the 2nd century BCE, Sparta had changed. Not all at once, not in a flood, but quietly, like a stiff spine beginning to bend after years of holding firm. Roman tourists were already visiting the city by this time, treating it less as a political power and more like a curiosity, a living exhibit of old-time discipline. One Roman writer described Sparta as a place where men still eat in silence and sit on bare stones, though they rule nothing but their stories. Indeed, the standing state had become a museum piece. The rigid public life, the agorge, the austere meals, all of it remained in form, but not in spirit. The posture persisted, but the meaning drained slowly from it. One moment captures this transition well. The Roman general Aemilius Paulus, after defeating the Macedonians at the Battle of Pydna in 168 BCE, passed through the Peloponnese. He stopped in Sparta, curious about the famous customs. The Spartans, ever proud, gave him a demonstration of their youths in training, standing, silent, motionless, waiting for command. But according to Plutarch, Paulus was underwhelmed. He observed that while the boys stood well, they had nothing to say. No poetry, no thought, no curiosity, just perfect posture and blank eyes. He reportedly remarked, "They are statues with breath." This was Sparta's reputation now, not fierce warriors, not shrewd leaders, but living monuments to stillness. So what happened? Many things. Economic isolation, military stagnation, political rigidity. While other Greek cities adapted to Roman power, reinventing themselves as centers of art, commerce, or philosophy, Sparta remained committed to a world that no longer existed. Even the famous anti-chair ethos began to soften. Roman villas were built nearby, complete with couches, dining rooms, shaded courtyards, and even libraries. Some Spartans began to visit. A few acquired low stools. Eventually, the young began sitting more, especially those raised outside the agorge. The old men still stood, but now it was more out of habit than pride. The shift wasn't announced. There was no ceremony, no formal declaration. Chairs are now acceptable. But one day, someone sat too long and no one corrected him. Another day, a bench was padded and no one protested. Like all strong customs, the end came not with a confrontation, but with a shrug. Yet the myth of the standing Spartan never entirely died. Even centuries later, writers would refer to the Spartan posture as a metaphor, a way of holding the self upright even when the world around you crumbled. And in modern times, when people imagine Spartan discipline, they think of unflinching warriors in bare rooms, standing, waiting, enduring. It's telling that we remember their posture more than their politics. Their physical form became shorthand for an entire worldview, minimal, controlled, relentless. But that comes with risks, because in defining virtue through the body, through stillness, endurance, denial, Sparta left little room for the messiness of growth. And when the world changed, they struggled to move with it. A society can stand too still for too long. So what are we left with? A city that distrusted comfort so much, it raised generations to stand rather than sit. A culture that taught boys to hold themselves like spears, sharp and upright. A people who believed that the moment you let your weight rest was the moment you began to weaken. And yet, in the end, even they grew tired. There's no tragic collapse in Sparta's story, no grand fall like Athens or Carthage, just a slow erosion, a gradual loosening of joints, a quiet unlearning of discipline. And maybe, somewhere in that quiet, one can imagine the last true Spartan elder rising slowly from a stone bench, stiff with age, refusing to lean too much on his staff. Perhaps he looks at the younger men, sitting easily on carved stools, laughing in ways their grandfathers never dared, and wonders if the city is lost, or perhaps he sees something else. A people learning that strength doesn't always mean standing. Sometimes it means knowing when to rest and when to rise again. Once upon a time, before marble gleamed on the Acropolis, and before Athens was even Athens, there was only a rocky hill and a question. Which god would claim this land? In the age of myth, when cities were still rising from the dust and naming was as sacred as building, the gods of Olympus occasionally stepped down from their mountain to lay claim to human places. And in the case of the city that would become Athens, two gods arrived, each with a very different vision of what the future should look like. The first was Poseidon, lord of the sea, earth shaker, god of salt and wave. He came with a trident and a temper. The second was Athena, goddess of wisdom, strategy, and quiet invention. She came with clear eyes and calm resolve. Both believed the city should be theirs, and so the gods gathered to settle it. Not with war, not with argument, but with a contest. The scene, as later told by poets and vase painters, is strangely small for a matter of such divine weight. A flat rise of land, the future site of the Acropolis, bare, sunlit, dust swirling in the wind. The gods in attendance were few. Zeus presided but did not interfere. A few other Olympians watched, curious, and the mortals. They stood below, heads bowed, waiting to see what these celestial patrons might offer. That was the nature of the contest. Each god would give a gift. The one whose gift proved more useful to the people would win the city. Poseidon, always dramatic, went first. He struck the rocky ground with his trident. The earth split, and from the crack surged a great pillar of water, a spring gushing up from the limestone with a roar. The people gasped. Here, in the parched land of Attica, was water, a divine spring flowing and endless. But when they approached it, cupped their hands, and tasted it, their faces fell. It was salt, a seawater spring, impressive, yes, but useless for drinking. And while Poseidon may have meant it as a symbol of naval power and trade, the immediate reaction was practical. This water could not quench thirst. It could not grow crops. The gift shimmered in the sun, but no one returned to drink from it again. Then came Athena. She stepped forward without drama, no lightning, no roar, just a stillness, and then a movement of her hand. She pressed her fingers to the ground. No cracking, no eruption, just a slow blooming of green, a sapling rising from the soil. It grew quickly, but not unnaturally, and within moments it stood at her side, slender, silvery, and crowned with narrow leaves, an olive tree. It didn't sparkle, it didn't thunder, but when the people approached, they saw what it held. Its leaves could be crushed for oil. Its fruit could be eaten or pressed. Its wood, sturdy but light, could build tools, wagons, even homes. The tree offered shade, sustenance, and fuel. Athena spoke only once. "This will last." And she was right. The decision was clear. The mortals, in quiet consensus, chose Athena's gift. From that moment on, the city became Athens. The olive became its sacred emblem. And Athena, though a warrior in other tales, became the goddess of reason, craft, and the kind of protection that doesn't require weapons. Poseidon, predictably, was furious, but he did not retaliate, at least not immediately. Instead, he retreated, his salt spring left bubbling behind, a reminder of what could have been. Some versions say he struck the earth again in anger, flooding the nearby plains. Others say he sulked beneath the sea. But the city had chosen, not the loud wave, but the quiet route. Now, we pause here. Because what seems like a simple myth of competition is, in fact, a story about values. Poseidon offered power. Athena offered endurance. Poseidon's gift dazzled in the moment. Athena's took time to understand. The olive tree does not grow quickly. It does not bear fruit for several years. But once it does, it can live for centuries. Some ancient olive trees still grow in Greece today, their trunks gnarled and hollow, but still producing fruit. What Athena gave was not just a resource. She gave a lesson in patience, planning, and the long arc of quiet utility. That tree, myth says, still stood on the Acropolis in later centuries. Even after the Persian invasion, when the city was burned and the temples destroyed, the olive tree allegedly sprouted again from a blackened stump just a day later. A symbol of survival. A gift that didn't dazzle, but endured. And what of olive oil? It became sacred, used not only in food, but in rituals, medicine, bathing, and burial. Athletes anointed themselves with it. Priests burned it in lamps. Warriors rubbed it on the armor to prevent rust. In short, it became a thread that tied daily life to the divine. And unlike Poseidon's gift, which vanished into myth, Athena's gift became civilization itself. Still, one must wonder, when faced with two gifts, one dazzling, one dull, how often do we choose the one that glows rather than the one that grows? After the contest was over, and Athena's olive tree had rooted itself into the rocky hill of the Acropolis, something subtle but profound began to unfold. The people of the fledgling city, now called Athens, didn't immediately celebrate with monuments or parades. There was no thunder, no fanfare. Instead, they began to adapt. They took clippings from the tree and planted them across the slopes of Attica. These cuttings, called moriae, were considered sacred, property not of individuals, but of the city itself. Even centuries later, their descendants were watched closely by civic inspectors. Damaging or removing one was a crime, often punishable by exile. Why so much fuss over a tree? Because the olive, in quiet ways, changed everything. Let's begin with its oil. Olive oil in modern times is associated with cuisine, flavor, health. But in ancient Greece, it was everywhere. It was fuel, burned in small terracotta lamps to light homes, altars, and temples. It was medicine, rubbed on wounds, mixed with herbs, and believed to soften skin, ease pain, and restore strength. It was currency, traded in amphorae across the Mediterranean, stored in granaries and tallied in city inventories. And it was identity. Athletes at the Olympic Games would anoint themselves in oil before competing, partly for grip and protection, partly as a ritual gesture. Victors were often crowned with olive wreaths and awarded vessels of sacred oil, sometimes from Athena's very own groves. One event, the Panathenaic Games, held in Athens every 4 years, awarded champions massive jars, Panathenaic amphorae, filled with olive oil from the sacred groves. These jars, painted with Athena on one side and the event on the other, were valuable not only for their contents, but for their symbolism. Strength earned through discipline, rewarded with something deeply local. The oil inside them wasn't just nourishment. It was Athenian identity in liquid form. Meanwhile, the tree itself transformed the land. Much of Attica is rocky, dry, and uneven. Grain struggled there, pastures were limited, but olive trees, with their deep roots and tolerance for drought, thrived. Their leaves, silver green and waxy, helped preserve moisture. Their gnarled trunks resisted fire. And their shade, while modest, was enough to offer rest on hot days. They didn't demand rich soil. They made do with what was there. And in that way, the olive tree came to mirror Athens itself, a city of limited resources, squeezed between mountain and sea, that nevertheless found ways to flourish. Olive groves soon dotted the hillsides. Families passed down trees through generations. Trade routes were forged, connecting Athens with Egypt, Phoenicia, and Italy, all drawn by the slow golden oil pressed from the fruit of a goddess's gift. It was never a luxury. It was a foundation, and it shaped how Athenians thought. The olive tree grows slowly. A newly planted sapling can take 10 years or more to bear usable fruit. And yet, people planted them anyway, knowing they would not benefit, but their children might. This kind of thinking, long, deliberate, intergenerational, was baked into the civic character of Athens. In fact, Solon, one of the city's early lawgivers, was said to have passed reforms while refusing to promise immediate results. When asked why he enacted laws that would only take effect after his death, he replied, "Because I plant as the olive grows, so others may reap in time." There is then a quiet logic in Athena's gift. The olive does not flash. It does not utter roar. But it teaches patience. It rewards consistency. It survives hardship. And above all, it binds people to the future. Even the way it was harvested had meaning. Olives are not simply plucked. They are gathered by hand, or with careful beating of the branches, gently enough not to harm the wood. The pressing of oil involved stone mills, cloth bags, and slow filtration. It took days, weeks, sometimes longer. This process, tedious but rewarding, shaped the rhythm of rural life. It gave jobs, fed communities, and demanded the kind of time that aligns people with the seasons, the soil, and one another. And unlike other crops, the olive was perennial. It returned year after year. It required pruning, not replanting. Care, not recreation. A tree planted by a parent might fruit for their grandchildren. A grove planted by a city could sustain it for centuries. There is something deeply human and deeply hopeful in that idea. Still, the original tree remained special. The olive tree on the Acropolis, said to be descended from Athena's own hand, was watched carefully through the centuries. Herodotus, writing in the 5th century BCE, claims that when the Persians burned Athens and torched the Acropolis in 480 BCE, the olive tree was scorched to black. But within 2 days, he says, a new shoot sprang up from the stump, a green signal of survival, a symbol that the goddess had not abandoned her people. Later, rulers replanted the site. The Romans revered it. The Byzantines preserved the tradition. And even today, a descendant of the sacred olive is said to stand near the Erechtheion, gnarled, twisted, but alive. Its roots, literal and metaphorical, still wind through the city. So what began as a contest became something else. A lesson in how the quiet choice, the slower gift, can last longer than any flourish. Poseidon's spring is gone. The salt water that once roared from the rock now exists only in story. But Athena's olive endures. Still, one can't help but wonder, how many of the most important gifts in our lives began without spectacle, just a patient gesture, offered in silence, waiting to take root. By the classical age, the olive tree was no longer just a gift from a goddess. It had become something more subtle, more powerful, something embedded in the Athenian psyche. It was not merely a symbol of peace, nor just a product to trade. It was how they thought. This wasn't Athena's only myth. She had dozens, tales of battle, wisdom, inventions, strategies, victories. But somehow, none of those stuck quite the way this one did. The story of the olive tree had no monsters, no drama, no thunderclap. Just 2 gods, 2 gifts, and a city that chose the one that took longer to understand. And perhaps that's what makes the story so quietly profound. Let's look again at Athens, the city named for her. For all its later drama, wars, plagues, political revolutions, Athens always carried within it the shape of the olive. It bent under pressure but did not break. It returned, sometimes scorched, sometimes reduced, but always somehow still growing. Even its democracy, for all its flaws, was a kind of olive tree, built on patient structure, civic pruning, the idea that citizens should tend to the city not for immediate reward, but for long-term survival. There's a reason Solon, the early lawmaker, chose not to enrich himself, but to write laws that would take generations to mature. There's a reason the Athenian assembly gathered under open sky, surrounded by groves. The olive's shadow fell across policy, philosophy, even poetry. It was more than a resource, it was a model. Of course, olive trees don't last forever. They are durable, yes, and can live for centuries, but eventually they hollow out. The wood becomes brittle, the bark cracks, yet often a new shoot will emerge from the base, twining up through the old. In this too, the olive mirrors human civilization. Empires rise, flower, fade. But if the roots are deep enough, something new will grow. Maybe not the same shape, maybe not the same fruit, but still something living. And in the myth, this cycle is embedded. Athena didn't just gift the tree and leave. She stayed, became protector of the city. Her wisdom guided artisans, builders, soldiers, poets. But her first act, her defining act, was to plant. She gave something slow, something that required care, something that didn't win applause but outlasted applause. Even today, thousands of years later, the olive remains a bridge to that ancient moment. In Greece, in Italy, in the Levant, across the Mediterranean basin, the trees still grow. Farmers still tend to them, often by hand. Families still pass down groves. And in many places, an olive tree marks the oldest thing on the land. Older than the house, the road, even the graves nearby. There are trees in Crete said to be over 2,000 years old. Their trunks are twisted, split, some even hollowed out like caves. But they flower each year, they fruit, they persist. They are not dramatic. They are not impressive in the way mountains or rivers are, but they stay quietly, constantly. And maybe that's the quiet wisdom of Athena's story. The contest for the city wasn't won through spectacle or force or even popularity. It was won by usefulness, by endurance. Poseidon gave what shimmered. Athena gave what stayed. In a world that often celebrates the immediate, the sudden flood, the shining prize, this myth reminds us that the most valuable things are often the ones that take the longest to see. A tree planted by a hand of thought. A gift whose roots go deeper than its branches. And so, when you see an olive tree on a hillside, in a grove, or carved into a coin, you're not just seeing a plant, you're seeing a choice. A choice made thousands of years ago to favor usefulness over spectacle, to prefer patience to passion, to build something not for now, but for later. Still, one question lingers, as all good myths do. In a world full of Poseidon's waves, how often do we still choose Athena's roots? Sisyphus was a king, but not the kind of king remembered for building cities, or leading armies, or writing laws. Number Sisyphus is remembered for something else. A rock, a hill, and an eternal failure. You've probably seen the image. Man pushing a boulder uphill only for it to roll back down again and again, forever. His name has become a symbol of futility, of punishment, of the endless loop of effort without reward. But like many famous punishments, the story that led to it is quieter, more peculiar, and full of cleverness rather than wickedness. Sisyphus didn't try to destroy the gods. He simply tried to outsmart them. He ruled over a small city called Ephyra, later known as Corinth. It was a place of trade, perched between land and sea, always watching the comings and goings of gods, men, and messengers. And Sisyphus? He noticed everything. He had a habit of seeing things others shouldn't, of asking questions that made Olympians uncomfortable, of noticing patterns, listening to whispers, and, most dangerously, talking about what he learned. It started small. He once spotted Zeus, god of thunder and king of all Olympus, sneaking away to abduct a river nymph. This sort of behavior was hardly rare for Zeus, but Sisyphus saw it, remembered it, and later told the nymph's father, a river god named Olympus. In exchange for this information, Sisyphus asked for a spring to be brought to his city. Water in exchange for gossip. The deal was struck. The spring gushed forth, and Zeus was furious. But Zeus didn't strike Sisyphus down right away. That would have been too simple. Instead, he waited. Sisyphus, meanwhile, continued living, ruling, watching, and wondering, like many mortals in Greek myths, what exactly happened after death. The underworld in those days was a mystery to most. You died, you were ferried across the river Styx by Charon, and then shadow. You became a shade. You drifted. You forgot. But Sisyphus wasn't satisfied with this vague answer. He wanted to know what really happened. And more than that, he began to wonder if he could avoid it. Not in the sense of immortality. No one escaped death forever. But what if he could delay it, outsmart it, make death confused? It was the kind of idea that only a clever man with too much time and too little reverence could entertain. And then, one day, he got his chance. Thanatos, the personification of death itself, came to take him. In myth, Thanatos is often depicted not as a robed skeleton, but as a quiet figure, wings sometimes, or dark robes, but always with calm inevitability. He doesn't bargain, he doesn't fight, he simply collects. But when he came to Sisyphus, he made a mistake. He told him in advance. Perhaps it was arrogance, perhaps it was custom, or perhaps Thanatos, being a god of inevitability, didn't think anyone could resist. But Sisyphus was ready. He invited Thanatos into his home, offered him wine, spoke politely, and while Thanatos waited, Sisyphus showed him something new. A device, he claimed, that needed testing. A pair of manacles, shiny, clever, designed to bind the hands without pain. Would Thanatos try them on just for a moment? The god agreed, and Sisyphus snapped them shut. Just like that, death was chained. What happened next was chaos. Without Thanatos to carry out his duties, people stopped dying. Soldiers wounded in battle lay groaning, unable to pass on. The sick grew weaker, but lingered. The elderly became more frail, but did not fade. No funerals, no mourning, just a world that kept suffering without release. It didn't take long for the other gods to notice. Ares, the god of war, was especially angry because without death, his battles became meaningless. He could no longer send souls to the underworld. No victories, no fear, just endless skirmishes with no end. He descended to Corinth, found Sisyphus, broke the manacles, and freed death. Thanatos, silent and furious, took the king immediately. But Sisyphus had prepared for this too. Before dying, he had instructed his wife not to bury his body, not to perform the proper rituals, not to place the coin beneath his tongue to pay Charon. Just leave the body exposed, he said. She obeyed, perhaps confused, perhaps frightened. And so when Sisyphus reached the underworld, he complained. He told Persephone, queen of the dead, that he had been mistreated, that his wife had dishonored him, that his body lay rotting, unburied, unwept. It was a scandal, he said, a disrespect. Would it not be fair, he asked, to return to the upper world just briefly to punish her, to correct this injustice? Persephone, moved by this show of domestic shame, agreed, and Sisyphus returned to life. He took one look at the sun, the city, the sea, and refused to go back. He had cheated death twice, first by binding it, then by appealing to the laws of ritual. It was clever, it was bold, and as you might expect, it did not go unpunished. Zeus had enough. Eventually, Hermes was sent to retrieve the trickster, dragging him back, this time with no loopholes, no bargains, no escape. And Sisyphus was condemned, not to pain, not to fire, but to something else entirely. An endless task. A boulder, a hill, a repetition. A job that required cleverness but could not be solved. And that's where we leave him, at least for now. Pushing a stone upward, sweating, straining, reaching the peak only to watch it roll back down. But perhaps that punishment isn't just about futility. Perhaps it's about cleverness turned inward. A mind always looking for an edge, now trapped in a world where edges don't matter. Still, one can't help but ask, was the crime trying to cheat death, or simply refusing to play the game by godly rules? The hill isn't described in the old texts. No ancient poet tells us what it looked like. No painter recorded its slope. No philosopher bothered to measure its incline. All we know is that it was high enough to exhaust and low enough to start over. At the top, the rock always paused for a breathless second, maybe trembling, maybe waiting, then rolled back down, tracing the same groove as always, the same path, the same return. And Sisyphus, he walked after it, again and again and again. It was a punishment designed not to break the body, but to wear down the spirit. The ancient world was full of vivid torments, vultures eating livers, endless thirst and hunger, rivers that receded when approached. But Sisyphus was given something different, a task with no finish, a logic with no reward, a test of will that never ends. Let's pause there, because this is where most people stop the story. The image is iconic. The moral seems simple. Don't defy the gods. Don't outwit death. Don't push your luck, or you'll push a rock forever. But myths, especially Greek ones, rarely mean only what they seem. What if the tale of Sisyphus isn't just about punishment? What if it's also about how we live with the consequences of our own cleverness? Sisyphus was clever. Too clever, perhaps. He didn't accept the world as it was. He found loopholes. He questioned everything. But in the end, he was given a task he couldn't question. A task he couldn't think his way out of. That's a kind of irony the Greeks loved. And yet, there's something else, something quieter in that endless repetition. You see, Sisyphus does not cry. He does not scream. He does not bargain anymore. He simply keeps going. The French philosopher Albert Camus, writing in the 20th century, famously looked at this story and saw not despair, but a strange kind of victory. One must imagine Sisyphus happy, he wrote. Why? Because when there is no escape and no reward, the meaning must come from within. If the gods cannot break your will, even with absurdity, then in a way, you've won. Think about it. Each time Sisyphus walks down that hill, he knows exactly what's waiting. There's no surprise, no change, no illusion of progress. Just the same stone, the same slope. And yet, he walks back anyway. He chooses to do it. That moment between the rock's fall and the next attempt might be the only freedom he has. And in that tiny space between failure and effort, he asserts himself. He becomes not a victim of punishment, but a participant in persistence. You can see why this myth has survived. It speaks to labor, to the work that never ends, to the tasks we return to day after day, the unpaid effort, the invisible roles, the endless tending of what never seems to stay done, the parent who tidies a room only to tidy it again, the farmer who weeds the field, though weeds always return, the builder whose work crumbles with time. None of it feels like glory, but all of it is real. And Sisyphus, perhaps, is not just a warning. He is a mirror. Ancient Greeks didn't believe in moral perfection. They believed in limits, in knowing your place, yes, but also in facing the absurd with dignity. Sisyphus didn't accept death. He didn't accept silence. He didn't even accept punishment quietly. But eventually, he did accept the rock. And maybe that's what redeems him. Not his cleverness, not his rebellion, but his choice to keep walking. Because once all the choices are gone, when the gods have made their decree, and the task is set, the only freedom left is how you carry it. Of course, the gods never explain themselves. Zeus doesn't issue a speech. Thanatos doesn't gloat. Hermes doesn't pity. The punishment is given and the myth moves on. But we are left with that image. A man alone walking down a hill, not to escape, but to begin again. And in that walk, in that step, we find something strangely human, because we all roll our own stones. We all return to something we've done before. We all carry burdens that don't lead anywhere visible. But we carry them because that's what life is. Not a single arc of achievement, but a repetition of effort, meaning made by motion. And in that sense, Sisyphus is not cursed. He is simply like us. Still, one has to wonder if Sisyphus ever stopped, not from defeat, but from understanding. What would the gods do then, by the end of his story, if stories can be said to have ends in eternity? Sisyphus has become less a man and more emotion. We stop seeing his face. We stop thinking about his crime. We stop remembering he was a king. We see the back hunched against the slope. We see the legs steady on the incline. We see the hands firm on the stone. The gods gave him a punishment meant to strip him of meaning. But in doing so, they created an image that resonates more than most of their temples. It's strange, isn't it? That one of the most remembered figures in mythology did nothing grand after death, only repeated a quiet, pointless task. And yet, there's something dignified about it. The Greeks did not worship ease. They admired endurance. They honored those who stood firm, who bore burdens, who faced chaos and limits without flinching. Sisyphus became an accidental saint of that idea, not because he succeeded, but because he didn't stop when success was no longer possible. Of course, there were interpretations. Some said the rock represented ambition, the heavy thing we choose to carry. Others said it stood for knowledge, the danger of seeing too much, knowing too much, asking too many questions. Sisyphus, after all, did not sin in violence or greed. He sinned by exposing divine behavior. He witnessed, he spoke, he named what the gods preferred to keep hidden. And so he was silenced, but not destroyed. He was set to labor in full view of eternity, still visible, still thinking. If you look closely, you might notice that his punishment is very specific. He is not chained. He is not beaten. He is not screamed at, scolded, or hunted. He is alone. And his labor isn't chaotic. It's perfectly ordered. The same slope, the same stone, the same timing. It is meaningless only if you believe meaning comes from outcome. But if you believe meaning can come from process, from the act of showing up, trying again, even knowing the result, then Sisyphus becomes something else entirely. A craftsman of failure, an expert in persistence, a quiet master of one impossible thing. That's what makes his story so enduring. Unlike Icarus, he doesn't fall. Unlike Prometheus, he doesn't give fire. Unlike Odysseus, He doesn't return home. He just keeps going. And in doing so, he becomes a kind of mirror. Think of the parts of your own life that feel cyclical, repetitive, tasks that undo themselves. Laundry, dishes, bills, routines, mornings, even grief. They return. You address them. They return again. And maybe, if we're honest, we don't want a way out of them. We want a way to be inside them without feeling erased. That's where Sisyphus lives now. Not in pain, but in repetition made sacred. And so we return to the hill. Perhaps it's grey, with scrubby moss along the slope. Perhaps it's high enough that clouds gather near the summit. Perhaps Sisyphus can see stars from the top, just before the stone trembles and rolls again. Perhaps he pauses each time to breathe, to place his hands more carefully, to adjust his footing, not because it will work, but because he is still here and still trying, and that is enough. Maybe that's what endurance is, not glory, not success, not recognition, but the simple refusal to surrender to meaninglessness. He is not resisting the gods anymore. He is not bargaining. He is not escaping. But he is still choosing. So what do we learn from him? That the punishment didn't erase his cleverness. That effort is not always wasted, even when the result vanishes. That to repeat something hard over and over is not weakness. It is a strange, specific form of strength. And maybe, just maybe, that some hills are worth climbing even if nothing waits at the top. One final thought. In eternity, who changes more? The God who imposes the punishment, or the man who finds purpose in it? Long before he was the god of wine, and long before grapes dripped from temples in his honor, Dionysus was a child, and a strange child at that. He was not born like other gods. He was twice born, first from Semele, a mortal woman, and then, after her death, from the thigh of Zeus, stitched there after lightning had taken her. He was, quite literally, sown into power, a son of storm and accident. He didn't grow up on Olympus. Instead, he was hidden, passed from nurse to nymph, raised in caves and forests, kept far from Hera's wrath, taught not among marble columns, but among ivy leaves, tree bark, and untamed goats. The other gods, with their polished grandeur, looked at him with some discomfort. What was this child who laughed too loudly, wept too easily, and didn't seem to sit still? And so Dionysus wandered, through valleys, through forests, through hot plains and thorny coasts. His early years were a blur of places, each one shaping him just a little. He learned to make things grow, grapes mostly, but other things too. Ivy that climbed too fast, figs that fermented too quickly, herbs that made dreams slide sideways. He didn't rule. He wandered. He didn't build temples. He danced in clearings. He didn't wage war. He let things ferment. That was the secret he carried, though he didn't fully understand it yet. That some power doesn't come from fire or force, but from transformation. The first wine wasn't wine yet. It was juice crushed from wild grapes, sweet and dark and sticky. Dionysus stored it in a goatskin pouch and forgot about it. Days passed. Then weeks. The sun warmed it. The skin breathed. Bacteria danced their invisible dance. And when he remembered it, opened it, and tasted it again, he laughed. The sweetness was gone, replaced with something deep, biting, alive. His mouth burned. His cheeks warmed. His thoughts grew strange and soft at the edges. He had created something new. Not water, not nectar, not just grape juice. He had found fermentation. He had found wine. And as usual, he wasn't entirely sure what to do with it. He began to share it, first with shepherds, then with wanderers, then with animals even, a little at a time. And something curious happened. People laughed harder. Their movements grew loose. Their voices grew louder or softer than they meant. They told truths they didn't know they carried. And after a while, they forgot themselves. Just a little. Not in a bad way, but in a way that loosened something tight inside. It wasn't the drink alone. It was what it unlocked. The boundaries between person and person blurred. The masks people wore in daily life slipped. Fear melted. Control dissolved. Some wept. Some sang. Some danced until dawn. This was not the power of Zeus, who ruled by decree, nor the wisdom of Athena, who solved by logic, nor the cunning of Hermes, who moved with tricks and speed. This was a different force, more subtle, more dangerous. The power of losing control, of melting boundaries, of becoming more than one thing, of becoming less than one thing. And Dionysus, though still young, saw how powerful that was. He began to attract followers, not worshippers exactly, but companions, satyrs with their hooves and flutes, maenads, women who left their homes and wandered wild, old men too, who had once been respected but now sought something forgotten. They carried torches. They wore garlands. They drank deeply. And everywhere they went, something changed. A village that saw them pass through might wake to find all its wine gone, and its people strangely at peace, or weeping, or laughing, or changed in ways they couldn't explain. It wasn't always joyful. Sometimes it was too much. People broke or forgot too much. But often it was something needed, because the world, you see, was too tight. People were too bound by duty, too starched by rules, too brittle with self-control. And Dionysus, with his clumsy sandals and laughing eyes, was a god of undoing. Still, not everyone welcomed him. Some feared what he represented. Others mocked him. This so-called god who cried easily, wore ivy, and didn't sit still. In their temples, he was a stranger. But outside the temples, on hillsides, by fires, under stars, he was known. Not because he was perfect, but because he reminded people of what they forgot. that joy and madness and grief and freedom are not opposites. They are branches of the same vine. And the wine, it spread, slowly, then quickly, from goatskin to clay pot, from forest to farm, from ritual to commerce. But it was never just the liquid. It was the transformation inside it. The quiet lesson hidden in its sweetness that sometimes, to find yourself, you have to dissolve a little first. Still, you have to wonder. When Dionysus first tasted his strange, half-rotted grape juice, did he know what he was inventing? Or was it just another happy accident that the world wasn't ready for? Once Dionysus realized what he had made, this strange, potent drink that could untie knots in the soul, he didn't try to own it. He shared it, not from a throne, but from a flask, not in grand cities, but in forgotten corners, not to kings at first, but to herders, shepherds, widows, and wanderers. He poured wine for people who had never tasted anything more powerful than well water. And in doing so, he began to offer something else, something unwritten, a different way of being. The people who joined him were not mighty or orderly. They weren't generals, priests, oracles, or philosophers. They were those who wanted to feel something beyond what the world allowed. And that is when trouble began. Because Dionysus, without meaning to, had created not just a drink, but a movement. Wine was not just a beverage. It was a ritual, a release, a moment where rules softened and other versions of life slipped into view. But cities do not always welcome softness. Order has no patience for blur. Temples rarely open their doors to dances, and kings do not love a god who tells people that ecstasy is free. So Dionysus began to hear a word whispered behind his back. Foreign. Never mind that he was a son of Zeus. Never mind that his bloodline traced back to Olympus. His worship was wild. His joy was unlicensed. His ceremonies made people cry or shout or dance in ways that civilized society found uncomfortable. He was called outsider, even when standing in his own homeland. In Thebes, where he had once been a baby hidden by frightened hands, his name was spoken with suspicion. The king there, Pentheus, was orderly, sharp, polished. He prized control. He respected Apollo, Athena, gods of clear rules. When word came that a god of vines and women's songs had entered the countryside with maenads and music, Pentheus bristled. He declared Dionysus a fraud, a corrupter of women, a liar pretending at divinity. And when the revels spread outside the city, he sent soldiers to arrest the so-called god. Dionysus let them take him, smiling, silent, calm. They brought him in chains, but the chains unraveled. They locked the doors, but the doors blew open. They tried to question him, but he answered in laughter and wind. It was not that he fought back, It was that structure dissolved around him. Still, Pentheus would not relent. He dressed himself in disguise, woman's garb some say, to spy on the wild dances of Dionysus's followers. He wanted proof, wanted scandal, wanted to expose this chaos for what it was. Instead, what he found was something more powerful than rules. Something older. In the woods, in the thickets, among women no longer bound by hearth or city, Dionysus was present. Not as a man, not even as a god, but as a force. And Pentheus, he was seen as a spy, an intruder, a danger. What happened next varies by telling, but in all versions, it ends the same. Pentheus was torn apart by hands that did not know what they held. His own mother among them, driven by something larger than herself. And Dionysus, he walked away. This wasn't revenge. It wasn't cruelty. Dionysus didn't choose violence. But when power resists softness long enough, something breaks. And Dionysus's power had always been in that breaking, in the shattering of boundaries, in the undoing of rigidness, in the dissolution of masks. After Thebes, the world changed a little. His cult grew. His name spread, no longer whispered in fear, but sung in festival. Other cities opened their gates. His vines grew on foreign hills. His wine poured across seas. And eventually, even Olympus had to make space. Not because he demanded it, but because people kept calling his name. Not in temples, but around fires. Not in sacrifice, but in song. Not in war, but in transformation. Still, Dionysus remained strange. Even after joining the pantheon, he didn't behave like the others. He came and went. He traveled. He wore veils. He changed shape. Some said he appeared as a youth, others as a bearded wanderer. Sometimes man, sometimes woman, sometimes beast. He was never just one thing. And perhaps that's what frightened the old gods most. Not the madness, not the wine, not the dancers, but the fact that Dionysus was a god who could not be defined. And yet, despite all that, he never ruled a realm. No mountain peak bore his name, no sea, no sun, no forge. He ruled the in-between, the place between joy and sorrow, between waking and dream, between the self we show and the self we hide. And there, in that twilight space, he offered a cup, not to command, but to invite. Drink, he seemed to say, not to forget, but to remember something older than memory. Still, one wonders, did Dionysus create the wine for mortals? Or did mortals create Dionysus simply by needing a god to explain why we sometimes need to lose control? By the time Dionysus was accepted as a proper Olympian, his story had already traveled far, not just in words, but in roots. Vines now clung to terraces and temple walls. Grapes grew where once there were only olive trees and figs. Amphorae filled with wine crossed seas, passed from port to port, traded for grain, salt, glass, and stories. But more than the product, it was the idea that spread. Wine was not simply a drink. It was a ritual, a change, a moment that invited people to step sideways out of themselves. And Dionysus, for all his strangeness, had become something steady, a companion to the in-between. Across Greece, festivals sprang up in his name. Not just one or two, but many, each with its own season and flavor. The rural Dionysia, with its processions and masks. The Antisteria, where old wine was opened and the dead were welcomed. The city Dionysia, where plays were performed not as entertainment alone, but as part of sacred practice. It was under Dionysus's gaze that Greek tragedy was born. Yes, tragedy. Not because he was a god of sadness, but because he was a god of truth, the kind that can only be told when the usual rules are momentarily suspended. On his days, you could wear someone else's mask, speak what couldn't normally be said, grieve in public, laugh inappropriately, let go. Dionysus never demanded temples of marble, but he received offerings in wooden stages and shouted lines. He became a god of theater, of performance, of stepping out of self and back in again, different. And isn't that what wine does too? Takes you out, brings you back, leaves you altered, even if only a little. Not erased, just blurred, softened, more porous. Yet even as he was welcomed, Dionysus remained uneasy in his godhood. He didn't strut like Apollo or thunder like Zeus. He was rarely found in polished halls. He stayed in the margins, moving, changing, fermenting. People poured libations to him, yes, but they also spoke to him privately when no one was watching. When sorrow became too sharp, when joy spilled over, when control cracked, and something ancient stirred beneath the surface. In those moments, Dionysus was near, not to judge, but to witness. The Romans would call him Bacchus. The cults would shift, grow more elaborate. The myths would get stranger, more adorned. But the core remained. He was the god who let you fall apart safely. The god who told you it's okay to lose your shape sometimes. Because identity, like wine, can ferment. It can become something else. It can sour and then sweeten again. And the wine? It kept changing too. In fields across the Mediterranean, people learned to tame the process, but only a little. Fermentation, after all, is never fully controlled. It depends on air, temperature, wild yeast. The grape must surrender before it becomes wine. And that surrender, tiny, invisible, was part of the ritual too. Each time someone poured a cup, they were repeating Dionysus's original act, forgetting something and discovering something else. That's what makes him different from other gods. Most gods teach clarity, rules, lines. Dionysus teaches what happens when lines dissolve. He's the god of masks and the face beneath them, the god of illusion and truth braided together, the god who makes people laugh and then cry without knowing why, not because he's cruel, but because he knows that people need both. So, where is Dionysus now? You won't find him in most temples. You won't hear his name in daily prayer. But you might feel him at a table where people speak honestly for the first time. In a dance where the rhythm takes over and the self recedes. In a story that wounds and heals at the same time. Or in the quiet that comes after the glass is emptied, when you're just tipsy enough to see clearly. That's when he's closest. Not in chaos, not in drunkenness, but in release. And the vines, they still grow. In neat rows now, yes, and with carefully bred varietals. But the old ones remain too. Twisted, stubborn, clinging to rocky soil. Some are hundreds of years old. Some older still. Some wild. And they remember. Not in words, but in taste. In the slow sweetness. In the sharpness that follows. In the way one cup leads to a thought that was always there, waiting. So next time you raise a glass, you might think of him. Not to worship, not to toast, but to remember that once a god forgot a skin of grape juice under a tree. And from that accident came something timeless. A way to come undone, gently. One last question remains. If Dionysus is the god of losing control, then why does he so often bring people exactly what they need in the frost-bitten world of Norse myth, where gods walk on shaky ground and fate coils tighter than thread? Even the wisest of gods made strange choices. Odin, the All-Father, the Wanderer, the one-eyed keeper of riddles and runes, was not a god of easy wisdom. He didn't inherit knowledge. He didn't discover it in books. He didn't have it whispered to him by doves or sung into his ears by muses. No, Odin earned it. And the price was steep. So steep, in fact, that he once decided the best way to gain greater wisdom was to hang himself from a tree for 9 days, pierced by a spear, with no food, no water, and no guarantee it would work. Because knowledge, in the Norse world, wasn't just something you could learn. It was something you had to suffer for. Let's start with the tree. It wasn't just any tree. It was Yggdrasil, the world tree. A vast ash tree whose branches touched all realms, gods, men, giants, the dead. Its roots tangled in deep places, Mimir's well, the realm of hell, the icy past, the fiery future. It was alive, and yet it held everything. And Odin, looking at it, saw something that even other gods didn't. That if he truly wanted to understand the shape of the world, not just rule it, but know it, he would have to go beyond comfort, beyond safety, beyond life. He would have to go to the edge of death willingly. And so he did. No one made him do it. No curse was placed. No enemy forced his hand. It was his own idea. In that way, it wasn't a punishment. It was a sacrifice. A strange one, yes. Because Odin did not sacrifice an animal or a servant or even a limb, though he would do that later too. He sacrificed himself to himself. The Norse called it sjálfur sjálfum mer, myself to myself, an offering of the highest sort. So he climbed the world tree, not like a squirrel or a boy after apples. He climbed as a god, carrying purpose in every step. When he reached the right place, he looped a rope around his neck, took his spear, Gungnir, and drove it through his own side. And then he hung, not for minutes, not for hours, 9 days and 9 nights. The sagas don't say what he thought about during that time. No dreams are recorded, no visions explained, no angels or ghosts came to comfort him. Just the image, a god swaying from a branch, starving, bleeding, silent, watching the roots below and the sky above and something in between. On the 9th day, something changed. Not in the world, but in his mind. He saw something. Not fire, not a face, not a prophecy, but symbols, lines, shapes, forms. He saw the runes, not just letters, as we might think of them today, but living concepts, each one with a power, a story, a force of its own. They weren't given. They weren't learned. They were revealed because he had suffered enough to see them. He reached, not with hands, but with thought, with spirit, and he took them. That's how Odin became the god of wisdom, not by birth, not by battle, but by sacrifice. And the knowledge he gained wasn't cheerful. It wasn't comforting. It didn't make life easier. If anything, it made everything heavier. Because now he knew how things must end. He knew that the gods would not live forever. That Ragnarok, the great unmaking, was coming. That his own death would be brutal, inevitable, foretold. He knew that the best he could do was prepare, delay, influence, shape the end just a little. And still, he bore it. So when people ask why Odin is so serious, why he walks the world in disguise, why he speaks in riddles, why he gives away eyes and blood and breath, the answer is simple. He knows what's coming, and he's trying to make it matter. But here's the strange part. The runes he gained, he didn't hoard them. He taught them to the other gods, to men eventually, to seers and poets and stone carvers. Because real knowledge isn't about control. It's about transmission. Even if what you teach leads to your own end. The Vikings who carved those runes didn't just write names or messages. They etched power, memory, warning, charm. They believed that language had weight, that speaking or writing something could change the world, even if only slightly. That was Odin's gift. Not answers, but a way to shape questions so they last. So when you see the image, Odin, one-eyed, hunched, robed in grey, whispering to ravens, carrying the weight of unseen knowledge, you can remember that it all began with a rope, a tree, a choice, and 9 long nights with nothing but wind and silence. Still, one wonders, was the wisdom worth it? Or did Odin hang himself not just to learn the runes, but to test whether there was any meaning in suffering at all? When Odin finally loosened the noose and fell back to earth, it wasn't triumph that greeted him. It was cold earth, blood-stiff robes, a silence that rang deeper than before. He didn't return glowing or holy. He returned, changed. The runes now lived behind his one good eye, etched into his thoughts, carved into the back of every word. They weren't just symbols, they were tools, weapons even, each one a thread that tugged at the great weave of fate. But there was a cost to having them. Because when you understand something deeply enough to use it, you also understand how little control you really have. The Norse believed that fate, word, was not something you could rewrite. It wasn't a story with alternate endings. It was a weaving, and the Norns, the old cold women beneath the tree, wove it without pause. Even the gods were threads in that tapestry. What Odin had gained was not the power to undo it, but to read it more clearly. He could shape how things unfolded, influence choices, warn others, delay disasters, plant ideas. But he could never fully prevent the end. And now he knew that. The runes gave him knowledge of many things. The way to heal a wounded man, the charms to protect in battle, the words to calm a storm, the patterns to ease childbirth, the whispers that could bind a foe or unlock a hidden door. And stranger things still, the rune to speak to the dead, the rune to remember lifetimes not your own, the rune to silence truth, the rune to make lies beautiful. These weren't casual tools. They were secrets made solid. And Odin, newly returned from his hanging, now carried them in his voice. He could sing spells that made men forget, carve spells that made wood weep, breathe spells that made swords tremble. But if he could teach others, why didn't he teach everyone? Why not share the full power? Because Odin was not a god of generosity. He was a god of selective revelation. He gave to those who were ready, or desperate, or clever enough to ask the right question in the right way. To give wisdom too freely, he believed, was to cheapen it. He had not nearly died to hand out magic like bread at a feast. And so Odin became a wanderer again, not just a king of gods, but a grey-cloaked stranger seen on cold roads, whispering in riddles, testing the hearts of mortals. He asked questions that didn't seem like questions. He offered advice that sounded like warnings. Sometimes he helped, sometimes he didn't. But always, he watched. Not like a father, more like a chess player, or a poet who edits life like a line of verse. And the spear wound? It never fully healed, because you don't climb the world tree and return untouched. He carried the ache in his side, not just as pain, but as memory. Every time the spearhead twisted beneath his ribs, he remembered. 9 days, no food, no company, no guarantee of return. The runes didn't erase suffering. They just gave it structure. Eventually, others would seek knowledge too. Some would climb lesser trees. Some would sacrifice lesser paths. Some would think the runes were just letters and miss the power entirely. But the true students of Odin never asked for shortcuts. They asked, instead, the question that mattered most. What am I willing to give up to understand even a sliver of the world? That was the bargain. That still is the bargain. Wisdom demands offering, not once but always, in time, in attention, in comfort, sometimes in blood. Odin just made the cost visible. He hung for all to see, not to impress, but to warn. This is the price. Are you sure you want to know? Still, one wonders, if Odin could see every fate, every death, every unraveling thread, did the knowledge give him peace? Or just a clearer picture of how helpless even gods can be? Long after the spear wound had scarred over, long after the runes had settled into his breath and bone, Odin sat beneath the same tree, Yggdrasil old as the sky, and watched it sway in winds older than memory. He was not a young god anymore, though in truth, he never had been. Even as a child, Odin had felt the weight of questions that had no answers. And now, after centuries of wandering, bargains, blood, and secrets, he had more answers than anyone, but not much more peace. Because knowing is not the same as controlling. And Odin, for all his wisdom, could never stop the future from arriving. That's the strange thing about being a god in Norse myth. You don't live outside time. You don't float above fate. You walk toward it, eyes open. Every prophecy, every riddle, every symbol carved on stone or bone or shield, all of it pointed forward toward Ragnarok, the doom of the gods. Odin had seen it in dreams, in glimpses, in signs, in the stony silences of the Norns, who wove fate and never looked up. He knew how it would go. He would fight the great wolf, Fenrir. He would lose. He would die. The gods would fall. The world would burn. And from the ashes, something new would grow. That was the plan. That was the truth. And still, he prepared. He wasn't trying to avoid it. He was trying to make the most of what time he had. He trained warriors. built alliances, planted knowledge where it might one day bloom. He whispered things into the ears of the doomed so that at least they would face the end knowing they had mattered. This was not the work of a king. It was the work of a gardener in winter, planting seeds he would never see bloom. The runes helped, not because they let him change fate, but because they sharpened his sight. They taught him to speak less and observe more, to speak in verse where meanings could twist and survive, to make deals that rippled outward like frost across a pond. He spoke with the dead, learned from giants, taught mortals in dreams. He gave his eye for knowledge and saw more clearly with one than most did with two. But there was loneliness in it too. Other gods laughed, drank, loved without dread. Thor with his hammer, Freya with her tears, Loki with his mischief and scars. Odin brooded, not because he was bitter, but because he was always looking 10 steps ahead. He sat at the roots of Yggdrasil, listened to the wind in its branches, felt the breath of the wolf in the distance, still young, but growing, always growing. He did not cry, but sometimes the ravens on his shoulders, Hugin and Munin, thought and memory, sat very still, because even they did not have words for what Odin carried. And yet, despite the doom, despite the knowledge, Odin did not give up. That's the part most people miss. They see the gloom, the sacrifice, the dread. They miss the resilience. He kept going, not because he thought he would win, but because he knew the fight was part of the story. That even when the end is written, the way you arrive at it matters. So he led, he learned, he watched, and he whispered secrets into the dark, not to be heard today, but to echo when the tree cracks and the sky burns. That's why the image of Odin hanging from the world tree remains so powerful. It's not about pain, or madness, or even sacrifice. It's about choosing to suffer in pursuit of meaning. It's about refusing easy answers, about stepping into the dark and saying, I would rather hurt and know than be comfortable and blind. Even now, his story lingers, not in firelight myths or temple songs, but in quieter places, a carved rune on a forgotten stone, a one-eyed wanderer met on a lonely road, a whisper in the wind that sounds like an old man asking you a question you didn't know you needed to answer. That's Odin. Not heroic, not gentle, not easy, but willing. Willing to trade blood for wisdom, willing to die for truth, willing to hang from the edge of the world alone, just to catch a glimpse of the pattern beneath it all. And perhaps that's the lesson, that wisdom, true wisdom, is never clean or complete. It comes in fragments, in scars, in sacrifice. It demands something real. And the only question is, when your time comes, what are you willing to give up just to understand a little more? in the grand halls of Nineveh, beneath walls inscribed with lions and gods, amid the thunder of chariots and the scribble of reed pens, a great king sat down to brag, and not about conquest, not about spears or temples or crushed rebellions, but about something far more essential. A ditch. A long, winding irrigation canal carved through the dust and clay of ancient Assyria. Its construction had taken months, thousands of workers, endless shovels shouting foremen cartloads of soil. And for this, King Sargon II wanted the world to know. He had commanded it. He had paid for it. He had seen to its glory. He had, in his own words, caused the fields to drink deeply. This was Assyria in its prime. Around the 8th century BCE, the empire sprawled like a map, unrolling itself, stretching from the Tigris to the Mediterranean, chewing through kingdoms like a slow, iron-toothed beast. It was a world of kings who called themselves shepherds, but ruled like storm gods. Palaces gleamed, clay tablets multiplied, armies moved like shadows, and yet, without water, it would all wither. Mesopotamia, the land between rivers, was fertile but not easy. Its bounty came at a cost: irrigation, flood control, constant labor. The rivers, Tigris and Euphrates, were moody, flooding without warning, retreating in dry seasons. Crops lived or died by the calculated redirection of their fury. That meant ditches, canals, channels, aqueducts of dirt and sweat and planning. So when Sargon ordered a new canal to connect the waters of the Zab River to the plains near Dur-Sharrukin, his newly built capital, it wasn't just a civil project. It was divine order made manifest through engineering. Sargon didn't wield a shovel, of course. He wielded scribes who recorded the work in florid cuneiform. They described in unhurried lines how His Majesty, King of the universe, in wisdom unmatched, drew forth waters like a serpent from the rock, which in practice meant surveying dusty ground, rerouting mud, digging, and more digging. But that's not how it was told. To the Assyrians, water control was cosmic. The king wasn't just improving crops. He was taming chaos, bringing order to the wild, giving life to the land. The canal became not just a trench in the earth, but a symbol of power, permanence, and divine favor. The inscriptions go on and on. 3 full paragraphs, sometimes more, dedicated to the dimensions of the ditch, its width, its depth, the gleam of its water, how the gods looked favorably upon its flow. This was not mere pride. It was proof. Proof that Sargon was not just a warlord, not just a king of conquest, but a king who provided, who ensured that barley would sprout, oxen would drink, and temples would not crumble from drought. In Assyria, that mattered, perhaps even more than conquest, because conquest could always be undone. Borders shifted, Cities fell. Rebellions simmered. But a working canal, that stayed, that fed, that outlived kings. Even today, archaeologists trace those ancient channels, still visible from the air, long since dry yet persistent, like scars or signatures. And so, in his inscriptions, Sargon names not just cities conquered, but watercourses built. To us, that might seem dull. To him, it was legacy. The slow, muddy kind. The kind with no trumpets, no gold, no applause. Just earth moved, water guided, fields greened. That was civilization, one shovel at a time. Still, one wonders, did Sargon truly believe that the gods smiled more on a perfect ditch than a perfect war? Or was it just easier to control rivers than men? In the ancient city of Dur-Sharukin, Sargon's freshly built capital, seated proudly in the northern plains of Assyria, the canal in question wasn't merely functional. It was ornamental, ritualized, documented. It was dug with forced labor, of course, but it was written about as though the king himself had knelt in the mud, whispered a prayer, and drawn the course with his finger. Every inch of it was chronicled by the court scribes, not in dry lists or engineering diagrams, but in epic verse carved into slabs of clay. You can almost hear the stylus scratching. The canal, wide as the tail of a crocodile, deep as the shout of the god Adad, cuts through the land with the certainty of divine intent. And further down, by command of His Majesty, He who sees the winds and commands the rains, the waters flow obediently to the threshing floor, where barley dreams in the dust. Was any of that literally true? Not likely. What we know from archaeology is that Sargon's ditch was roughly 30 kilometers long, cut by workers under the blazing sun, lined in places with stone to prevent collapse, reinforced at the junctions to handle surges during the flood season. It was brilliant, practical infrastructure, and it was also, through the lens of Assyrian royal self-mythology, a holy act of alignment between king and cosmos. A canal wasn't just irrigation, it was righteousness made wet. Assyrian kings measured their worth in many ways. The cities they crushed, the tribute they collected, the gods they honored, and importantly, the order they imposed on chaos. That meant suppressing rebellion, and it also meant telling rivers where to go. Floodplains had no loyalty. They shifted, overflowed, and ruined good land. Unless a king commanded the water, and when he did, it was not only clever, it was cosmic. That's why the scribes took such care. These were not casual clerks. They were curators of permanence. Their job was to write things into reality, to shape how Sargon would be remembered, not just in the next generation, but in centuries beyond. They wrote as if the clay tablets were mirror pools for the gods themselves. Even the dullest details, lengths of irrigation trench, quantities of diverted water, were given the treatment of epic heroism. Sargon didn't authorize infrastructure. He bent the will of the land to the righteousness of his crown. What's remarkable is that this strategy worked. Dur-Sharrukin became a well-fed capital. The canal brought not only water, but legitimacy, because nothing says, "I will outlast you," quite like turning a floodplain into granary gold. But of course, this was still Assyria, and Assyria was always one rebellion away from ruin. The irony is that just a few years after Sargon completed the canal and finished boasting about it in full poetic detail, he died in battle, far from home, in a corner of the empire where loyalty wore thin. And for all the glory of his ditch, his body was never returned to Dur-Sharrukin. In Assyrian theology, that mattered. Dying far from home, unburied, was a dangerous omen. It suggested disfavor, instability, even divine abandonment. His son, Sennacherib, inherited not just the crown, but the burden of his father's unfinished myth. And what did he do? He moved the capital, abandoned Dur-Sharrukin, and started a new canal. It's almost poetic. A king digs a ditch and declares it divine. He dies. His son digs a better one and declares that divine. The rivers don't care. They keep flowing where they're told, until the shovels stop, the ditches dry, and the empire that dug them forgets why it started in the first place. Still, the scribes kept writing. They inscribed every canal, every sluice gate, every small stream redirected with stone and sweat. Because memory in Assyria was not what people remembered. It was what was written in clay. And the clay remembered, long after the cities were burned, long after the palaces crumbled, long after the gods of wind and war were forgotten. The ditches remained, dry now, silent, but visible. To satellites, to surveyors, to quiet archaeologists brushing dust off baked tablets in museums, murmuring to themselves, "King Sargon, may your canal rest well." Still, one wonders, did the king truly care about water? Or did he just understand that to be remembered forever, all you had to do was move the earth, then tell a very, very long story about it? Centuries after Sargon's canal first cut through the earth, the ditch remained, not as a functioning waterway, no, but as a trace, a scar in the ground that no empire could fully erase. To the farmers of later ages, it was just a curious depression in the soil. To shepherds, it was a place where grass grew differently. To birds overhead, it was a faint curve winding through a field that had forgotten the feel of a plow. But to archaeologists and to scribes long dead, it was proof that someone had once cared enough to move the earth inch by inch with the steady conviction that infrastructure could be divine. What makes the story of Sargon's ditch so oddly powerful isn't just the digging. It's the insistence on being remembered for it. This was a king who could have filled his inscriptions with battles and blood. And he did, of course. But he paused for the canal. And not just in passing. He gave it detail, length, width, depth, the way the waters curved, the channels cut for vineyards, the gardens made green. The gods thanked, the omens interpreted. 3 full paragraphs, possibly more in some versions. It was deliberate. It was boring. And that's what makes it beautiful. In a world full of conquerors, Sargon chose to also be a hydraulic engineer, at least in narrative. And in doing so, he reminded future kings and us that glory isn't always forged in fire and war. Sometimes it's carved in mud, measured by how many granaries filled, how many olive trees bore fruit, how many goats wandered unthirsty into spring. These things don't make headlines. They don't inspire epics, but they hold up the world. Sargon's ditch fed people, and because it fed people, it fed myths. The canal was more than practical, it was ideological. It said, this land obeys, this king provides, this empire lasts. That was the real irrigation, the redirection of belief, from fear to structure, from drought to rhythm, from fleeting power to permanent shape. Of course, Assyria did not last forever. Empires rarely do. The Babylonians came, the Persians, the Greeks, the Romans, the Ottomans, the archaeologists, each layer peeling back the old ones, each one finding the same story underneath. Clay tablets, dry canals, names that once filled the mouths of kings. And yet, the ditch remains visible. Even now, if you fly over northern Iraq and tilt your lens the right way, at the right time of day, when the sun leans low and shadows stretch, you might just catch it. A thread, a line, a suggestion of order in a chaotic land. You'll see where the water once ran. And if you know how to look, you'll see something else. The shape of a story. Not loud, not violent, but insistent. A king, a ditch, a belief that moving dirt could make a man immortal. It's a quiet kind of legacy, one that doesn't roar, it rustles, it murmurs, it waits, until someone, centuries later, picks up a tablet, reads the words, and pauses, just long enough to whisper, this man really did brag about a ditch for 3 whole paragraphs. And in that moment, Sargon lives again, because the water may be gone, but the words still flow. So the final question is, in the end, is it better to be remembered for something boring that lasted, or something brilliant that disappeared? Centuries after Sargon's canal first cut through the earth, the ditch remained. Not as a functioning waterway, no, but as a trace, a scar in the ground that no empire could fully erase. To the farmers of later ages, it was just a curious depression in the soil. To shepherds, it was a place where grass grew differently. To birds overhead, it was a faint curve winding through a field that had forgotten the feel of a plow. But to archaeologists and to scribes long dead, it was proof that someone had once cared enough to move the earth inch by inch with the steady conviction that infrastructure could be divine. What makes the story of Sargon's ditch so oddly powerful isn't just the digging. It's the insistence on being remembered for it. This was a king who could have filled his inscriptions with battles and blood. And he did, of course. But he paused for the canal, and not just in passing. He gave it detail, length, width, depth, the way the waters curved, the channels cut for vineyards, the gardens made green, the gods thanked, the omens interpreted. 3 full paragraphs, possibly more in some versions. It was deliberate. It was boring. And that's what makes it beautiful. In a world full of conquerors, Sargon chose to also be a hydraulic engineer, at least in narrative. And in doing so, he reminded future kings and us that glory isn't always forged in fire and war. Sometimes it's carved in mud, measured by how many granaries filled, how many olive trees bore fruit, how many goats wandered unthirsty into spring. These things don't make headlines. They don't inspire epics. But they hold up the world. Sargon's ditch fed people. And because it fed people, it fed myths. The canal was more than practical. It was ideological. It said, this land obeys. This king provides. This empire lasts. That was the real irrigation, the redirection of belief, from fear to structure, from drought to rhythm, from fleeting power to permanent shape. Of course, Assyria did not last forever. Empires rarely do. The Babylonians came, the Persians, the Greeks, the Romans, the Ottomans, the archaeologists, each layer peeling back the old ones, each one finding the same story underneath. Clay tablets, dry canals, names that once filled the mouths of kings. And yet, the ditch remains visible. Even now, if you fly over northern Iraq and tilt your lens the right way, at the right time of day, when the sun leans low and shadows stretch, you might just catch it. A thread, a line, a suggestion of order in a chaotic land. You'll see where the water once ran. And if you know how to look, you'll see something else. The shape of a story. Not loud, not violent, but insistent. A king, a ditch, a belief that moving dirt could make a man immortal. It's a quiet kind of legacy. One that doesn't roar. It rustles. It murmurs. It waits. Until someone, centuries later, picks up a tablet, reads the words, and pauses. Just long enough to whisper, This man really did brag about a ditch for 3 whole paragraphs. And in that moment, Sargon lives again, because the water may be gone, but the words still flow. So the final question is, in the end, is it better to be remembered for something boring that lasted, or something brilliant that disappeared?
In the golden heat of the Egyptian sun, scattered across the desert just outside ancient Thebes, lies the weather-worn base of a statue so large that even its legs are taller than most buildings. No body, no head, no throne, just a pair of massive stone feet resting on an enormous platform. They belong to Ozymandias, or rather, to Ramesses II, the real pharaoh behind the legend. And for centuries, those feet have stood silently as the sand slowly encroaches, the wind scrapes, and the stories accumulate. Because this isn't just a statue. It's a reminder of how even the greatest rulers occasionally lose interest halfway through a grand idea. Ramesses II was no minor pharaoh. He ruled for 66 years, one of the longest reigns in Egyptian history. He fought battles, built temples, carved his face into mountains, declared himself divine, fathered over 100 children, and ensured his name echoed from Nubia to the Mediterranean. But amid all that grandeur, one project stands apart. Not because it succeeded, but because it stopped. In the desert near Luxor, Ramesses commissioned a colossal seated statue of himself. Carved from red granite, it was meant to rise nearly 20 meters tall, larger than life, even by pharaonic standards. Its construction was laborious. The stone had to be quarried at Aswan, over 170 miles away, transported upriver, dragged across land, positioned with mathematical precision. And then, it simply wasn't finished. The statue's torso never made it. It was carved, yes, but it cracked during transport, or possibly fell off the barge, or was never moved at all due to shifting priorities, war, or drought. Accounts differ, but what we know is this: the lower half of the statue made it to Thebes and was erected. The rest, never attached, never displayed, never seen again. In its incomplete state, the statue became something else. Less a monument, more a mystery. A king who ruled nearly 7 decades with armies, architects, and absolute power, left behind a half-finished self-portrait. And not just any portrait, one that, even unfinished, still bore an inscription carved with the quiet thunder of royal ego. I am Ozymandias, King of Kings. Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair. Which, if you're standing before just 2 legs in the middle of nowhere, feels a little ironic. Of course, the name Ozymandias is the Greek version of Uzerma tre Setepenre Ramesses Meriamun, Ramesses the Great's official throne name. The Greeks, visiting Egypt centuries later, couldn't resist the drama. They saw the broken statue, the faded boast, the sand swallowing it all, and they wrote. Centuries after that, the English poet Percy Bysshe Shelley made the image immortal. Round the decay of that colossal wreck, boundless and bare, The lone and level sands stretch far away. A poem about pride, impermanence, and the inevitable erosion of power. Except, the joke is that Rameses wasn't forgotten. In fact, he became more famous because of the failure of the statue than he might have from completing it. It's a strange kind of immortality, not from perfection, but from decay. Still, what did Rameses think? Did he plan to finish it later? Did he shrug when the torso cracked? Did some official bring the news and the pharaoh, sipping wine in the shade of a lotus pavilion, wave it off with a bored, "We'll build another one"? We don't know. But we do know this. He kept building other things. Temples, columns, obelisks, tombs, whole cities in some cases. He didn't stop building. He just stopped building this. And for some reason, that makes him feel strangely human. So here we are, nearly 3,000 years later, staring at a pair of stone legs in the Egyptian desert. Still standing, still impressive, still pointing to something that never quite happened. Still, one wonders, did Rameses ever realize that his unfinished statue would outlast the ones he completed? That the silence between the legs would speak louder than the king himself?
Centuries before Shelley ever dreamed of dusty colossi, the broken statue of Rameses was already famous, not because it was whole, but because it was not. Travelers passed it with camels and sandals again. Greek historians scribbled notes. Roman tourists marveled and misidentified it. And Egyptian priests, long after Ramesses' tomb had been sealed, walked past those stone legs on the way to their shrines and said nothing. Because by then, it wasn't just a statue. It was a symbol of forgotten intention, a monument to an unfinished thought. But what did the statue actually look like back in its prime? Or at least, back when people were still trying to finish it? Well, the lower half survives. 2 legs, seated, carved with extraordinary detail. The curve of the calf, the careful sandals, the engraved hieroglyphs boasting of Ramesses' power over all lands from sunrise to sunset. The base was wide, grand, and meant to support something massive. Archaeologists estimate the full height would have reached 60 feet, nearly 20 meters, had the torso and head been completed and installed. It was meant to sit like a god beside the temple of Amun, silently judging eternity. Instead, it sits like a memory, weathered and strange. The torso, of course, is gone, or maybe not gone exactly. In the 19th century, explorers stumbled upon an enormous shattered statue in the Ramesseum, Ramesses' mortuary temple. The stone chest lay face down, broken into pieces, face half missing, beard scattered, hands cracked off. It's widely believed this was the top half of the same statue. Originally carved in one piece from a single block of granite, quarried hundreds of miles away. It likely cracked during transport or was damaged while being dragged upright. One version of the story says it fell as it was being raised. Another says it never left the quarry. A third, perhaps the most poetic, says the king lost interest. After all, a man who ruled 66 years, could afford to abandon one self-portrait for a newer one every decade or so. But despite its incomplete state, the statue did something unexpected. It endured, not because of its face, not because of its perfect posture or royal gaze, but because it was broken. It became a mirror for every new visitor who saw it and thought, even this will fade. Shelley captured it in verse. Napoleon scholars drew sketches. Modern tourists take filtered photos beside the legs, never quite sure what they're looking at. Just some feet, a plinth, a whisper of the man who once sat atop it. But Ramesses, he wouldn't have minded. In fact, he'd probably be flattered. Because for all the poetic irony of the ruined statue, Ramesses wanted to be remembered. That was the entire point of Egyptian kingship, to build things that could not be ignored, to stamp your face onto walls, obelisks, temples, even the stars, to fill the desert with your name so thoroughly that forgetting became impossible. And in that, he succeeded. Even the statue he abandoned is still admired, still whispered about, still surviving in the imagination, half there and wholly unforgettable. Egyptologists, of course, study it for different reasons. They measure the granite's striations. They compare its stylistic flourishes to other known Ramesside works. They debate whether the craftsmanship shows signs of late-period stylization or early career ambition. But none of that changes what the average visitor sees. A giant base, no torso, and a grandiose inscription that boasts of works no longer visible. Which raises the question, what is a monument really? Is it a thing that exists, or a thing that once tried to exist? When the body of the statue is missing, do the legs still mean something? Do they stand on their own? Literally, yes. Figuratively, maybe even more so. Because the brokenness becomes the story. And imperfection, strangely enough, preserves legacy. That's the strange afterlife of rulers. Ramesses built temples still standing. He left behind architecture, military records, hundreds of statues that still have heads, arms, and full egos intact. But it's the one that fell apart, the one that was never quite whole, that became immortal in art and irony. Still, one wonders, was the unfinished statue a failure of planning or a gift to the future? A way to remind us that even the grandest dreams can crack under their own weight and still endure. Imagine this. You are walking across a flat plain near Luxor. The sun is low, casting long shadows. The sand is warm, soft, and very quiet. You pass a few scattered stones. Then ahead, you see them, two colossal feet, seated on a granite base. No head, no arms, just legs. That's all that remains of the statue of Ozymandias, Ramesses the Great, pharaoh of Egypt, builder of temples, father of cities and would-be god. He once ruled with the confidence of someone who could command the Nile. Now he rules as a pair of legs. And yet, he's still ruling, isn't he? Because you stopped, you looked, you remembered. That's the trick of monuments. Ramesses II had dozens of statues built in his likeness, many of them completed, grand and still standing. He filled Karnak with columns, Abu Simbel with mountain-carved faces, and temples with inscriptions so dense they barely left room for the gods. But none of those monuments stirred the modern imagination quite like this one, the broken one. It wasn't even one of his most important projects. Yet, because it collapsed, because it lay half buried for centuries, because someone found it and thought about it, it became a symbol of power, of decay, of ambition, and its eventual dust. The statue became famous not through glory, but through failure. It's one of the most famous unfinished works in history, and perhaps more than any of his achievements. It tells us something about how memory works. We remember stories that are incomplete. We linger on what might have been. We return to ruins, not just out of nostalgia, but because ruins let us imagine the whole. They leave room for poets, for tourists, for silence. In that sense, Ramesses achieved something very few rulers ever do. He made people care about the gap. The absence of his torso said more than any polished face could. When Shelley wrote his sonnet, he imagined a king whose arrogance was mocked by time. But the real Ramesses probably didn't feel arrogant at all. He just felt busy. Too many wars, too many temples, too many gods to flatter, too many sons to name. So one statue, just one, was never finished. And yet, this unfinished statue became eternal. The statue also teaches us something about scale. Ramesses ruled one of the most stable, wealthy periods in Egyptian history. He had enough stone, money, and manpower to try carving himself into eternity over and over again. But even he, with all that might, couldn't finish everything. This wasn't unusual in ancient Egypt. Many tombs, temples, and statues were started and abandoned. Sometimes the pharaoh died before completion. Sometimes a new king took over with different ideas. Sometimes materials ran out. Sometimes the Nile misbehaved. So many things could go wrong. And when they did, time took over. Sand moved in. Priests forgot the old prayers. New rulers chiseled out old names. And eventually, it was just rock again. That's why ruins matter. They're not just broken, they're alive with delay. A statue like Ozymandias's becomes more than a depiction of a ruler. It becomes a conversation between the past and the present. What did they mean to build? Why didn't they finish? Why are we still looking? Those are powerful questions, and strangely enough, they linger longer than answers. The Greeks who found the broken statue didn't know Ramesses' full story. The Romans didn't care about his lineage. The British poet who gave him eternal voice in verse never saw the statue at all, just a traveler's description. But they all imagined the same thing. A man who tried to be permanent and wasn't, and yet was. Because even in ruin, Ramesses kept talking. His statue became a metaphor for time, a sculpture of hubris, a parable with no sermon, just wind and granite. And maybe that's the quiet genius of it. Because while the inscription boasts, "Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair," the modern visitor doesn't despair. They reflect. They tilt their head and think about time and how little we get, and how strange it is that something unfinished can mean more than something perfect. Ramesses may not have planned that, but he'd likely approve. After all, he was never trying to be modest. He was trying to be seen. And 3,000 years later, you're still looking. Still, one wonders. If Ramesses could stand beside his broken statue now, would he frown at the missing parts, or simply nod and say, "Good enough"?